Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. February in Montana means one thing for power company maintenance crews: overtime and frostbite. I'd been driving these mountain service roads for 12 years, checking transmission lines after every major storm, and honestly thought I'd seen everything nature could throw at me. My supervisor, old Frank Garrison, used to joke that I knew every pothole and washout from Whitefish to the Canadian border. That particular Monday started like any other winter call-out. Just me and the company F-350, heading up to inspect Line 47 after the Weather Service reported 60-mile-per-hour winds the night before. Nobody else wanted the route, because it meant 4 hours of driving through nowhere just to check if some cables were still hanging where they should be. But the solitude never bothered me. At 37, after a messy custody battle that left me seeing my daughter every other weekend, those long drives gave me time to think without my apartment walls closing in. What strikes me now, thinking back, is how many locals tried to warn me without actually warning me. When I stopped at the Conoco station at the base of Copper Ridge Road to fuel up and grab coffee, the kid behind the counter, couldn't have been older than 19, asked which route I was taking up the mountain. I told him I'd follow the service road past Miners Creek, and his whole expression changed, like someone had walked across his grave. He started to say something, stopped, then just muttered that I should make sure I had chains and extra supplies. Even Nancy at dispatch seemed weird when I radioed in my position around noon, kept asking if I wanted to wait until tomorrow when they could send a two-man crew. But the forecast showed another system moving in by Wednesday, and if those lines came down, half of Glacier County would lose power. So I kept driving, watching the sky turn that peculiar gray-white that means serious snow is coming, completely unaware that by nightfall I'd understand why everyone who grew up in those mountains knew better than to travel that particular stretch of road alone. The accident happened around 3 in the afternoon, though accident isn't really the right word for what went down. I was navigating a particularly narrow section, where the service road hugs the cliff face, snow already falling heavy enough that I had to lean forward to see through the windshield. The truck's thermometer read -12, and even with the heater blasting, ice was forming on the inside corners of the windows. I just passed the old Forest Service marker, maybe mile 17 from the highway, when I saw what looked like a fallen tree branch across the road. Standard procedure says to radio it in before getting out to clear obstacles, but the static on my handset was so bad, I figured I'd move it first, then report when I hit a clearer spot. I stopped the truck, put it in park, grabbed my work gloves from the dash. That's when the steering wheel jerked hard to the right, like something had yanked it, and the whole vehicle started sliding sideways toward the drop-off. Physics is funny when you're on ice. Everything happens fast and slow at the same time. The F-350 weighs close to 7,000 pounds, and once it starts moving laterally on a slope, nothing's going to stop it. I remember pumping the brakes, useless on that glassy surface, while the passenger side tilted down toward a ravine I knew dropped at least 40 feet. The truck caught on something, probably a boulder under the snow, and flipped halfway before slamming into a cluster of pines about 20 feet down from the road. The impact threw me hard against the driver's door, and I heard the crack before I felt it, my left ankle folding in a way ankles aren't supposed to fold. The engine died immediately, that sudden silence after chaos that makes your ears ring. Snow was already pouring through the shattered passenger window, and I could smell hot metal and leaking fluids. My first coherent thought was about the satellite emergency beacon in my vest pocket, the one the company made us carry after a lineman died of exposure in 2016. My second thought, as I tried to move and pain shot up my leg like someone had driven railroad spikes through the bone, was that I was completely, utterly screwed. Getting the beacon activated took me almost 20 minutes. Every movement sent white-hot agony through my ankle, and I had to stop twice just to keep from passing out. The little LED showed it was transmitting, but the signal strength indicator kept fluctuating between 1 and 2 bars, sometimes dropping to nothing. Best case scenario, dispatch would get my distress signal and coordinates within the hour. Realistic scenario, with the storm getting worse and the weak transmission, maybe 3 or 4 hours. Search and rescue would need at least another 2 hours to reach me after that, assuming they could even navigate the road in these conditions. I managed to drag myself partially out of the truck to assess the situation, and that's when things started getting genuinely weird. The F-350 had left a clear path through the snow where it went off the road, but about 10 feet from where I'd stopped, I could see my own boot prints in the fresh powder, walking in a circle around the truck. Except I hadn't gotten out of the vehicle before it went over the edge. These were fresh tracks, maybe 30 minutes old based on how little snow had filled them in, and they were definitely from my Red Wing work boots, same distinctive tread pattern, same size. I told myself someone must have stopped to help, seen the truck go over, maybe walked around looking for the best way down. But that didn't explain why the prints matched my boots exactly, or why they just circled the truck without approaching it. Using the door frame, I pulled myself up enough to look around properly, and that's when I spotted the cigarette butts. 5 of them, stamped out and half buried in the snow near where the truck had stopped on the road above. Marlboro Reds, the gold band still visible on one. Here's what made my chest tighten. I don't smoke, never have, but more importantly, those butts were under fresh snow that had fallen after my crash. Someone had stood there smoking, watching my truck for at least 20 or 30 minutes after the accident. Long enough to finish multiple cigarettes. Long enough to walk down and around my vehicle. Long enough to help. But they didn't. They just watched. I tried the radio again. Got nothing but static that seemed to pulse in a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. The rational part of my brain said it was just atmospheric interference from the storm. But rationality becomes flexible when you're injured and alone with evidence that someone stood there watching you suffer. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, which happens around 4 in the winter up there. I needed to prepare for a long night, possibly my last if things went wrong. The truck's emergency kit was still intact, thank God. Thermal blanket, flares, first aid supplies, 2 bottles of water, some energy bars. I managed to wrap my ankle using gauze and an instant cold pack, though the swelling was already so bad I couldn't get my boot off. That's when I decided to check under the hood for the tow strap we keep coiled near the battery, thinking I could maybe use it to secure myself better in the tilted cab. I dragged myself around to the front of the truck, using the bumper and grille for support, popped the hood latch from inside, then pushed it open. The strap was gone, but not just missing, cut clean through where it attached to the frame. The edges were fresh, no rust or wear, sliced with something sharp like a knife or heavy-duty wire cutters. Someone had deliberately removed my ability to get pulled out if another vehicle happened by. My brain kept trying to find innocent explanations, but the evidence was stacking up in a way that made my skin prickle with more than just cold. Night in those mountains is absolute in a way most people never experience. No light pollution, no distant glow from towns, just complete darkness broken only by the snow reflecting what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. By 6 o'clock, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without the flashlight. I'd positioned myself in the driver's seat, leg elevated on the center console, thermal blanket wrapped tight, trying to conserve body heat and battery power. The beacon blinked its weak green light every 30 seconds, my only proof that help might eventually come. Then I heard it, footsteps crunching through the snow above me, slow and deliberate, circling where the truck had gone over. Not the quick, concerned pace of someone who'd just discovered an accident, but measured, patient steps. I grabbed the flashlight, aimed it up toward the road, caught a glimpse of a figure in a heavy brown Carhartt jacket and wool cap pulled low. Male, average height, couldn't make out the face. He stood at the edge, looking down at me, and for a moment I felt relief flooding through me. I started yelling, explaining I was hurt, needed help, had already activated my beacon but needed immediate assistance. The figure didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just stood there, hands in pockets, watching. After maybe 2 minutes, that felt like 2 hours. He turned and walked away, footsteps fading into the storm. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, but this time there were two sets. They moved differently than before, one heavy and slow, the other lighter, almost dancing through the snow. They'd stop directly above me, whisper to each other in voices too low to make out words, then move again. Sometimes they'd throw things down, small rocks that pinged off the truck's hood, branches that scratched across the roof, once what sounded like a glass bottle that shattered somewhere in the darkness. They were playing with me. I turned off my flashlight to save battery, and to avoid giving them the satisfaction of seeing my fear, sat there in the dark, listening to them move around up there like they had all the time in the world. The worst part was when they'd go silent for 10-15 minutes, just long enough for me to think they'd left. Then something would hit the truck again. My phone had no signal, hadn't since I'd passed the last cell tower 40 miles back. But I recorded a voice memo explaining everything, uploaded it to the cloud for when I got signal again, or for whoever found my phone if I didn't make it out. At some point, exhaustion and cold started playing tricks with my perception. I'd drift off for a few seconds despite fighting it, then jerk awake thinking I heard the truck doors opening, or feeling like someone was breathing on the back of my neck. But one thing was definitely real. Around 2 in the morning, someone tried the door handle on the passenger side. The doors had auto-locked when the engine died, a safety feature I'd never been more grateful for. The handle jiggled 3 times, patient and testing, then stopped. I held my breath, didn't move, played dead or unconscious. Through the cracked window, I could smell that same cigarette smoke, Marlboro Reds. So close it was like someone was exhaling directly into the cab. Then came a sound I'll never forget, fingernails dragging slowly across the glass, not scratching or tapping, just dragging in these long, deliberate strokes like someone petting an animal. It went on for maybe 30 seconds before stopping. The silence afterward was somehow worse than the sound itself, because I knew they were still there, just inches away, deciding what to do next. My satellite beacon kept blinking its pitiful green light, and I found myself counting the pulses like a prayer, willing rescue to come before these people, whoever they were, decided to escalate from psychological torture to something worse. The breakthrough came around 4:30 in the morning, not from rescue but from pure luck and desperation. I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, hypothermia starting to take hold despite the thermal blanket, when I heard an engine in the distance. Not search and rescue, wrong sound for a helicopter, but a vehicle on the road above. I grabbed one of the emergency flares, cracked the driver's door just enough to light it, and toss it up toward the road. The red glow illuminated the ravine, and for the first time, I got a clear look at my surroundings. There were more footprints than just the 2 sets I'd heard, at least 4 or 5 different boot patterns, all circling my truck like wolves around wounded prey. But what made bile rise in my throat were the drag marks in the snow, leading from the road to a cluster of trees about 50 feet from my truck. Something human-sized had been dragged there recently, the trail still visible despite the falling snow. The engine sound got closer, and suddenly there was shouting, not in English but in what sounded like Russian or Ukrainian. My tormentors, whoever they were, apparently hadn't expected company. I heard doors slamming, engines starting, vehicles peeling out on the icy road. Then blessed silence except for one voice calling down, asking if anyone was hurt. I yelled back, and within minutes 2 men in hunting gear were making their way down to my truck. They were brothers, Victor and Alexei something or other, heading out for early morning elk hunting when they saw my flare. They took one look at the scene, the footprints, the cigarette butts, the cut toe strap, and exchanged glances that told me they knew exactly what had almost happened. Victor stayed with me, while Alexei drove to where he could get cell signal to call for proper rescue. While we waited, Victor shared a thermos of coffee and told me I was lucky they decided to hunt this particular morning. He said locals had been finding abandoned vehicles on this stretch of road for years, always with cut toe straps, always with signs that someone had been watching, waiting. Some drivers were never found, others turned up miles away, dead from exposure but with injuries that didn't match just getting lost in a storm. The state police wrote them off as accidents, city folks who didn't respect the mountain. But everyone who lived up here knew better. There was a group, he said, maybe 5 or 6 people, who treated that road like their private hunting ground, except they weren't hunting animals. Search and rescue arrived just after sunrise, and I've never been happier to see those orange jackets in my life. They airlifted me out, and I spent 3 days in the hospital in Kalispell getting my ankle pinned back together. The power company put me on permanent disability after that, said the nerve damage in my ankle made it too risky for me to work on mountain roads anymore. Honestly, they didn't need to convince me. I moved to Billings, got a desk job doing logistics for a shipping company, and I haven't been back to Glacier County since. But here's what haunts me. When the state police investigated, they found my truck right where I said it would be, found all the evidence I described, but claimed it was just locals messing with an accident scene after the fact. No investigation, no follow-up, case closed. Victor called me a few weeks later, said they found another abandoned truck on that same stretch of road. Brand new Ford Ranger, tow strap cut, same cigarette butts scattered around. The driver, a geology student from the university, was never found. His beacon had been deliberately damaged, antenna snapped off. Victor said the police didn't even send a detective this time, just filed it as another weather-related disappearance. He told me the locals have a name for that group, call them the Watchers, and everyone knows to travel that road in pairs or not at all. Nobody talks about it openly because half the police force has cousins or brothers-in-law who might be involved, and the other half just doesn't care what happens to outsiders. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear fingernails on glass. That slow, patient dragging sound that means someone has all the time in the world and knows you don't. My therapist says it's PTSD, and maybe she's right, but I know what I know. There are people out there who've turned isolation into opportunity, who figured out that the right stretch of remote road in a snowstorm is the perfect killing ground. They watch, they wait, they disable your vehicle, and then they enjoy the show while you slowly realize that your accident wasn't an accident at all. The scariest part isn't what they do, it's that they've been doing it for years, and nobody with the power to stop them wants to admit they exist. I check the Montana news sometimes, looking for stories about missing drivers near Glacier County. There's usually 2 or 3 every winter, always on remote roads, always in bad weather, always with their vehicles found damaged in ways that don't quite make sense. The articles never mention cut toe straps or cigarette butts or boot prints that shouldn't be there. But I know the truth, and now you do too. If you ever find yourself driving through northwest Montana in winter, and the locals start acting strange when you mention your route, listen to them. Turn around. Take the long way. Because the Watchers are still out there, and they're very, very patient. People always warn you about driving through Appalachia after dark, but when you've made the trip a dozen times without incident, you start thinking they're just being dramatic. I'd been making quarterly runs from Charlotte to Cincinnati for my medical equipment sales territory since finishing college in 2012, and nothing worse than a speeding ticket had ever happened. That particular October night, heading back south after a successful week of demos, I figured I'd push through instead of stopping at a motel. My daughter's 3rd birthday party was the next morning, and I'd promised her I'd be there when she woke up. Around 11:30, just past the Virginia state line where the mountains get especially dark and cell towers become suggestions rather than guarantees, my front right tire exploded like a shotgun blast. The Ford Explorer jerked hard to the right, and I fought the wheel to keep from careening into the guardrail that separated me from a 100-foot drop into pure blackness. Gravel sprayed as I managed to ease onto the shoulder, heart hammering against my ribs while the ruined tire flopped its final death throes against the asphalt. When I finally stopped and killed the engine, the silence hit me harder than the blowout had. No traffic, no street lights, just my hazard lights painting the rock face beside me in rhythmic orange pulses. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and watched it search desperately for a signal that wasn't coming. The nearest town, according to the last sign I'd passed, was 17 miles behind me. I popped the trunk, grabbed the spare and the jack, and got to work by the light of my phone's flashlight, telling myself this was just another minor inconvenience in a long list of minor inconveniences that came with the territory. 20 minutes into wrestling with rusted lug nuts that hadn't been touched since the Explorer rolled off the assembly line, I heard the engine. Not the high whine of a sedan or the rumble of a semi, but the distinctive rattle of an older diesel pickup, the kind where you can hear each piston doing its job. The sound grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls, then began to slow. Relief washed through me as I stood up, wiping grease on my khakis, ready to flag down what I assumed would be a good Samaritan. But the truck didn't pull up beside me or even ahead of me. It stopped about 30 feet back, and then the headlights went dark. Just killed them completely, leaving only my hazards and the dim glow of my phone on the ground to fight against the mountain darkness. 2 doors opened and closed with deliberate precision, not slammed, just firmly shut like they were trying not to wake someone. My eyes strained to adjust, making out 2 shapes moving toward me in the pulsing orange light. One tall and lean, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. The other shorter but broader, built like someone who'd spent years hauling feed bags or working construction. Neither one called out a greeting, didn't ask if I needed help, didn't say a single word. They just kept walking toward me with this measured pace like they'd done this exact thing before and knew precisely how it would go. The tall one had something in his right hand, held low against his leg, and I couldn't tell if it was a tool or something else entirely. "Evening?" I tried, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Thanks for stopping, but I've got the spare right here. Should be good in a few minutes." The shorter one let out this small laugh, not a friendly chuckle, but something that made my mouth go dry. They kept coming, spreading apart now, one moving toward the front of my Explorer, the other circling behind. The tire iron was still in my hand from working on the lug nuts, and I found myself gripping it tighter, the cold metal suddenly feeling both reassuring and pathetically inadequate. The tall one finally spoke, his voice carrying a local drawl thick as molasses. "That's a nice watch you got there. Rolex?" It wasn't. Just a Seiko my wife had given me for our anniversary. But the way he said it, the way his eyes tracked to my wrist and then to the Explorer, to my laptop bag visible through the back window, I understood exactly what this was. The shorter one had positioned himself between me and the driver's door, while his partner stood blocking any path toward the front of the vehicle. They'd done this before, probably dozens of times, picking off travelers on this stretch of mountain highway where screams wouldn't carry and help wouldn't come. "Wallet, phone, watch, whatever's in the vehicle," the tall one said, finally raising what I could now see was a crowbar, tapping it against his palm in a rhythm that matched my hazard lights. "Make this easy on yourself." But something in their eyes, in the way they kept glancing at each other with these little nods and signals, told me that easy wasn't really on the menu tonight. They weren't just here for the robbery. There was something else, something in the shorter one's expression when he looked at my Explorer, at the child's car seat visible in the back, the stick figure family decal on the rear window. He was calculating, measuring distances, probably figuring out how long it would take to move my vehicle, where they could dump it. "Here's the thing," the shorter one said, pulling out what looked like a folding knife, letting it catch the orange light as he opened it with practiced ease. "Sometimes people report their cars stolen, say they got robbed, make all kinds of trouble for honest folks just trying to make a living. Can't have that." He took a step closer and I could smell cigarettes and something chemical on his clothes. Maybe meth, maybe just industrial cleaner. "So, we're gonna take a little ride together. Make sure you understand the importance of keeping quiet." That's when I knew with absolute certainty that getting in that truck meant never seeing my daughter blow out her birthday candles. The tire iron in my hand suddenly felt like my only chance, and I could see them both tensing, reading my body language just as clearly as I was reading theirs. The tall one moved first, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc meant to catch me in the ribs, but adrenaline had already taken over. I stepped inside his reach and brought the tire iron up hard, catching him under the chin with a crack that sent him stumbling backward into the guardrail. The shorter one lunged with the knife, and I felt it slice through my jacket, burning across my left arm. But momentum carried me forward, and I drove my shoulder into his chest, sending us both sprawling onto the gravel. We rolled, fighting for control of the knife, Rox digging into my back, his breath hot and sour in my face. I managed to get my knee up between us and pushed hard, creating enough space to swing the tire iron again. It connected with his wrist, and the knife went skittering across the asphalt. Behind me, I could hear the tall one groaning, trying to get back on his feet, spitting what sounded like blood and broken teeth. The shorter one scrambled for his knife, but I was already moving. Pure survival instinct driving me toward the Explorer. I yanked the door open, dove inside, and hit the locks just as the tall one slammed into the passenger window, leaving a bloody smear across the glass. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I threw it in drive even with the ruined tire flopping against the wheel well. The truck was still behind me, blocking a clean escape, so I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed it in reverse and floored it, the Explorer lurching backward on 3 good tires and 1 rim throwing sparks. The impact threw both men diving to either side, and I heard their truck's headlights shatter, the crunch of metal on metal. Then I was spinning the wheel, grinding forward, the rim screaming against asphalt as I pushed the Explorer to move, to get away, to get anywhere but here. They tried to follow. Of course they did. In my rearview mirror, I could see their truck lurching to life, one headlight now dark, weaving as they tried to match my erratic path. But their confidence was shaken, and my desperation gave me an edge. I rode that rim for 3 miles, sparks flying, the whole vehicle shaking like it might come apart, until I saw lights ahead, a 24-hour gas station, bright as heaven, with 2 semis parked outside and a state trooper filling up his cruiser. I practically crashed into the parking lot, horn blaring, blood soaking through my jacket sleeves, screaming for help before I even got the door open. The trooper had his hand on his weapon before he saw my condition, saw the destroyed wheel, the blood on my window, and suddenly everyone was moving, calling for backup, calling for an ambulance. They caught them 40 minutes later, trying to take a back road around a roadblock. Turns out I wasn't their first victim, not even close. The police found personal items from at least 12 other travelers in their truck, wallets and watches and phones, some dating back 2 years. 3 of those people had been reported missing, their vehicles never found. The shorter one, whose name turned out to be Carl Bratton, broke first and told them everything. About the ravine where they'd been dumping cars, about how they'd been working that stretch of highway since his cousin Roy got out of prison. Roy, the tall one, needed reconstructive jaw surgery and faced charges that would keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Carl got 25 years in exchange for his cooperation. They found 2 bodies in that ravine, 2 people who hadn't been as lucky as me, who hadn't fought back fast enough or hard enough. I made it to my daughter's birthday party, arm in a sling, stitches pulling every time I moved. But I was there when she woke up, just like I'd promised. When she asked why I had a bandage, I told her Daddy had gotten a little hurt, but was all better now. The truth was, I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that diesel engine slowing down behind me. I've changed my route, started flying instead of driving when possible, and I never travel those mountain roads after dark anymore. My wife wanted me to go to therapy, and I did for a while, but talking about it didn't change what I knew in my bones. I'd come within seconds of disappearing forever on that dark highway, of becoming just another missing person case that goes cold after a few months. The Explorer's gone, traded in for something newer, but I kept the tire iron. It sits in my garage now, still dented from where it connected with Roy's jaw. A reminder that sometimes the only thing standing between you and the darkness is your willingness to fight like hell for the morning. Rain doesn't usually sound angry, but that afternoon in the mountains near Breckenridge, it was pounding my Subaru's windshield hard enough to crack glass. Early November, and I'd been driving back from a conference in Denver when I decided to take what Google Maps promised was a scenic shortcut. 26, and convinced I knew better than the locals who'd warned me about storm season, I'd laughed off their concerns about mountain weather. My phone had one bar of signal that kept flickering in and out. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over anymore, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard showed it was dropping fast outside. Steam started rising from under the hood, mixing with the rain until I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. When that beat-up Ford pickup pulled up behind me, hazards flashing through the gray curtain of water, I didn't hesitate to roll down my window. He had one of those faces that made you think of old photographs, weathered and somehow timeless. Maybe 40-something with deep-set eyes that caught the dashboard light in a way that made them look almost silver. Said his name was Glenn, worked maintenance for the county, and he'd seen too many folks get stuck on this stretch during storm season to just drive past. His voice had this quality to it, soft but clear, like he was used to talking to spooked animals or scared children. He helped me push the car further onto the shoulder, tied a bright orange flag to the antenna so other drivers would see it, and offered to drive me down to Millbrook, this little nothing of a town about 15 minutes further into the valley, where at least I could wait out the storm somewhere warm. The whole ride down, he kept both hands on the wheel, told me about how these roads used to be mining trails, how his grandfather had worked the copper veins that ran through these mountains before the industry dried up. Millbrook consisted of maybe 12 buildings huddled together like they were trying to stay warm, most of them dark except for a general store with a flickering neon sign that read, "Provisions and Sundries," with half the letters burned out. Glenn pulled up right to the door, even got out in that torrential rain to help me with my backpack, making sure I made it inside before driving off. I wanted to thank him properly, maybe offer him gas money or something, but by the time I turned around after pushing through the door, his taillights were already disappearing into the storm. The store smelled like old coffee and wet wool, and behind the counter sat this woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it stretched her features, watching me like I'd just tracked mud across her clean floor, which I probably had. She introduced herself as Dolores, owned the place for 37 years, she said, and she had that way of talking where every statement sounded like an accusation. When I explained about my car and Glenn giving me a ride, her whole expression shifted, went from suspicious to something I couldn't quite read. She kept asking me to describe him again. What exactly did he look like? What exactly did he say? Even made me repeat the part about his grandfather and the copper mines twice. Then she got real quiet, started organizing things behind the counter that didn't need organizing, and finally said there wasn't anybody named Glenn working maintenance for the county. Hadn't been for years. The way she said it made all the warmth from the heated store suddenly feel insufficient. Before I could ask what she meant, the lights flickered and we heard this sound like thunder, except it kept going, kept building until the windows were rattling in their frames. Dolores grabbed a flashlight from under the counter, her knuckles white around it, and we both went to the window to look out. The rain had turned into something biblical, water rushing down the street like a river had decided to relocate, carrying branches and debris and things I couldn't identify in the dark. Then the real thunder came, and with the lightning flash I saw cars being pushed sideways down what used to be the main road, saw a whole tree floating past like driftwood. Dolores grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and pulled me away from the window, said we needed to get to the back room, get to higher ground, that this was worse than 1987 and that one killed 3 people. We spent 4 hours in that back room sitting on boxes of canned goods while the building groaned and water seeped under the door, rising inch by inch until it covered our shoes. Dolores had this battery-powered radio, and through the static we heard snippets about flash flood warnings, about roads washing out, about emergency services unable to reach the area until morning. Every time lightning lit up the small window, I could see her staring at me with this expression I couldn't interpret, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that scared her. Around midnight, when the water finally started receding and the rain eased to something merely torrential, she asked me again about Glenn, about whether I was absolutely certain that was the name he gave me. When I said yes, she pulled out this old photo album from a plastic tub, pages water-damaged and yellow, and showed me a picture from 1973, pointing at a man standing next to a county maintenance truck, a man with silver eyes and that same weathered face. His name was Glenn Hartley, she said, and he'd been one of the best workers the county ever had, knew every road and trail in these mountains like they were carved into his memory. Problem was, he'd disappeared during a flood in 1974, him and a woman named Beverly who'd been passing through just like me. They found his truck weeks later buried in mud at the bottom of Sawmill Canyon, but never found either body, and people in town had been telling stories ever since about seeing him during storms, always helping stranded motorists, always disappearing before anyone could pin down exactly where he'd gone. Dolores said she'd never believed those stories, thought they were just mountain folklore, the kind of thing people tell themselves to make sense of tragedies. But here I was, describing him perfectly, down to the way he held the steering wheel and the stories about his grandfather in the mines. Morning came slow and gray, with emergency crews finally making it through on the one road that hadn't completely washed out. They brought news that made everyone in the store go silent, made Dolores grip my shoulder until it hurt. My Subaru had been found 2 miles downstream, wrapped around a concrete culvert with the driver's side completely crushed. Would have killed anyone inside instantly, they said. But that wasn't the part that made people start whispering. Wasn't the part that made the sheriff show up an hour later with his laptop, asking to see the store's security footage. The timestamp on the external camera showed 7:47 p.m., just after dark, and there was Glenn's truck clear as day, him dragging something heavy toward the river, something wrapped in a tarp that left drag marks in the mud. The sheriff kept replaying it, zooming in, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, because the figure doing the dragging had my height, my build, even seemed to be wearing my conference lanyard that was still somehow visible in the grainy footage. They searched the riverbank for 3 days while I stayed in town, first because the roads were impassable, then because the sheriff had questions, lots of questions. Where exactly had Glenn picked me up? What exactly had we talked about? Did I remember anything unusual about the drive down to town? I kept telling them the same story, kept describing that 20-minute ride in detail. But the more I talked, the more I noticed gaps, little moments that seemed to skip like a scratched record. I couldn't remember getting out of his truck exactly. Couldn't remember the space between being in the passenger seat and standing at the store's door. The sheriff showed me the footage again and again, that figure in the rain dragging something. And each time I watched it, I felt this crawling sensation in my chest like my body remembered something my mind wouldn't let me access. On the 3rd day, a volunteer search team found something that changed everything, made the sheriff stop asking questions and start looking at me different. Half a mile downstream from where they'd found my car, tangled in tree roots along the bank, they pulled out a woman's body that had been in the water for decades, preserved by the cold mountain runoff. She was wearing polyester bell-bottoms and a macrame vest, had a driver's license in her pocket that read, Beverly Marsh, issued in 1974. But here's what nobody could explain, what made even the sheriff's hands unsteady when he showed me the evidence bag. She was wearing my conference badge from Denver, the one with my photo and this year's date, wrapped around her waterlogged neck like she'd grabbed it in the dark and never let go. The badge I thought I'd been wearing in the security footage, the one I couldn't find in my backpack no matter how many times I searched through it. The sheriff finally let me leave after the state police got involved, after they ran every test they could think of and found nothing that made sense. My prints weren't on the badge around Beverly's neck. The security footage was too grainy to prove anything definitively. And 3 witnesses had seen me in the store during the time the video showed someone by the river. They gave me back my belongings, drove me to the nearest rental car agency in the next town over, and suggested strongly that I might want to take a different route home. But before I left, Dolores pulled me aside in the parking lot, pressed something into my palm, an old brass key with a number worn almost smooth. She said it was from Glenn's old locker at the county maintenance depot, said maybe I should look inside before I tried to make sense of anything. Said sometimes the mountains keep their own kind of records that have nothing to do with what people write down in official reports. I drove to the depot on my way out of town, found the building half collapsed and abandoned for decades according to the dates on the condemned notices. Locker 47 was in the back, rusted but still solid, and inside I found a leather journal wrapped in plastic, pages filled with Glenn's handwriting. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared, and it described picking up a woman named Beverly whose car had broken down, described the way she'd trusted him immediately, described how he'd thought about all the other women who'd vanished on these mountain roads over the years, women the police never looked for too hard. But the next pages were different. Written in shaky script like someone writing in the dark, they described waking up in cold water, described being pulled by currents but unable to drown, described seeing through eyes that weren't quite his anymore, doing things he couldn't stop. The final entry just said, "The mountains remember everything, and during storms they make us remember too." I left the journal where I found it, drove home without stopping, and I've never taken a mountain road again, especially not during storm season. Especially not when helpful strangers offer rides to anywhere that sounds too good to be true. College was supposed to prepare you for everything, but nobody tells you that 6 months after graduation, you'll be living in your childhood bedroom again, staring at the same posters you hung up in high school. That's where I found myself in early March, scrolling through job listings and feeling like the walls were closing in. My buddy Jason called me up one night, said he needed to get out of town for a few days, clear his head after his engagement fell apart. We settled on a 4-day hike through the Appalachian Trail section in Pennsylvania. Nothing too ambitious, just enough to feel like we were doing something with our lives. I packed my gear that same night, desperate for any excuse to escape the suffocating routine of failed interviews and my parents' worried glances. We started our hike on a Wednesday morning, the kind of crisp spring day that makes you believe everything might actually work out. Jason barely spoke for the first few hours, just walked with that mechanical rhythm people get when they're trying to outrun their thoughts. Around noon, dark clouds started rolling in from the west, and by 3 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Rain started as a drizzle, then turned into sheets of water that soaked through our rain gear within minutes. We were 8 miles from the nearest road, pushing forward on a narrow trail that had turned into a muddy stream. That's when we spotted the shelter through the trees, one of those 3-sided wooden structures the trail maintenance crews build for emergencies. We practically ran for it, our boots making sucking sounds with each step, grateful for any protection from the storm that was turning day into twilight. The shelter was basic but solid, maybe 12 feet deep with a wooden floor raised off the ground and a slanted roof that extended past the open front. Someone had carved initials and dates into the support beams going back decades, and there was a logbook in a plastic bag hanging from a nail. The place smelled like wet wood and something else, something sour that made me wrinkle my nose. Jason dropped his pack and started pulling out his sleeping bag, while I checked the corners with my headlamp, finding old spider webs and mouse droppings, but nothing too concerning. We strung up a clothesline and hung our soaked jackets, then sat on the wooden platform eating cold granola bars and watching the rain turn the trail into a river. By 6 o'clock it was completely dark except for the occasional lightning flash that lit up the forest like a photograph. The temperature kept dropping, and we could see our breath forming clouds in the beam of our headlamps. Around 9, we decided to call it a night since there wasn't much else to do. I set up my sleeping bag on the left side of the shelter while Jason took the right, leaving a gap in the middle where we'd stacked our packs. The rain hammered on the tin roof with a sound like radio static, occasionally punctuated by thunder that seemed to shake the whole structure. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm and thinking how different this was from my bedroom at home, how the darkness here had weight to it, pressed against the shelter from all sides. Jason was already snoring softly, that deep sleep that comes from emotional exhaustion. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and closed my eyes, letting the white noise of the rain pull me under. Must have been around midnight when something woke me up. though at first I couldn't tell what it was through the fog of sleep and the constant drumming of rain overhead. Then I heard it again, cutting through the rain like it was meant to be heard. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like someone pulling a heavy sack across wet leaves. It started somewhere to the left of the shelter and moved steadily along the side wall, scraping and rustling with a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind or falling branches. I held my breath, every muscle in my body going rigid inside the sleeping bag. The dragging stopped right at the corner where the wall met the open front of the shelter, and for maybe 10 seconds there was just the rain. Then came footsteps, or what might have been footsteps, heavy and uneven, squelching in the mud just beyond where I could see. They moved along the front of the shelter, paused, moved again, like someone was examining the entrance. I wanted to wake Jason but couldn't make myself move, couldn't even turn my head to look at him. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it over the storm. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the shelter's opening. I could feel eyes on me, that primitive sensation that makes every hair on your body stand up. Lightning flashed, and for a split second I saw a shape, tall and wrong somehow, but the image burned out before my brain could process what I was looking at. Then came a sound that made my whole body go cold, a wet breathing, ragged and thick, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to catch their breath. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. This horrible wheezing just feet from where we lay. Something scraped against the wooden frame of the entrance, testing it, exploring the edges. Then, without warning, something slammed into the side wall with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. The whole shelter creaked and groaned. Another impact, this time lower, like someone throwing their shoulder against the boards. Jason jerked awake with a gasp, his headlamp clicking on and swinging wildly around the shelter. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, we heard the dragging sound again, this time moving around to the back wall. Jason grabbed his knife from his pack, a folding blade maybe 4 inches long that looked pathetically small in his shaking hand. We sat there in our sleeping bags, backs pressed against the wall, listening to whatever it was circle the shelter. The scraping sounds moved up the back wall, like someone running their fingers along the wood, searching for weak spots. Then came a different noise, metal on wood, rhythmic and deliberate, prying sounds. Something was working at the boards near the corner, trying to create an opening. We could hear wood splintering, nails groaning under pressure. I grabbed my hiking pole and extended it, holding it like a spear, knowing how useless it would be but needing something in my hands. The prying continued for maybe 5 minutes, patient and methodical, while we sat there barely breathing, waiting for boards to give way. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no scraping. Just rain and our own panicked heartbeats. We stayed frozen like that for another hour, maybe 2, taking turns keeping watch while the other pretended to rest. Neither of us actually slept. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow that moved with the lightning had us gripping our pathetic weapons tighter. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the rain, we could see the damage on the shelter's entrance frame. Deep gouges in the wood, fresh and raw, following the edge where a door would have been if the shelter had one. Splinters hung like teeth from the marks. Jason stood up first, moving carefully to the entrance and peering out into the misty morning. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and we could see maybe 20 feet into the forest. That's when he pointed to something in the mud about 10 feet from the shelter. A backpack torn nearly in half, its contents scattered and soaked. It was bright blue, practically new looking except for the damage. Definitely not something that had been sitting out there for weeks. We packed our gear in record time, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. Jason picked up the torn backpack with a stick, and we could see a name written in marker on the inside flap, Kevin Hartwell. There was a wallet in the side pocket, somehow still intact, with a Pennsylvania driver's license showing a guy who looked about our age, smiling in that awkward DMV way. The photo was dated just 2 months ago. We found more of his stuff scattered in widening circles around the shelter. A water bottle with teeth marks that went clean through the plastic, shreds of what might have been a tent, a boot with the laces still tied. The other boot was nowhere to be found. Jason took photos of everything with his phone, his hands trembling so bad most of them came out blurry. We debated calling for help right then, but we had no signal, and honestly, we just wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. The trail back was a muddy nightmare, but we practically jogged through it, looking behind us every few seconds, jumping at every snapped twig. It took us 4 hours to reach the parking area where we'd left Jason's car, about half the time it had taken us to hike in. We drove straight to the ranger station in town, our clothes still soaked and covered in mud. The ranger, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, listened to our story with an expression that went from skeptical to concerned as Jason showed her the photos. She made us write out statements while she called it in, and within an hour there were 2 state police cars in the parking lot. They found Kevin Hartwell 3 days later, about a mile from the shelter. I won't describe what condition he was in because, honestly, they didn't tell us much. Just that he'd been out there for at least a week. The official report said he'd gotten lost during the storm and died of exposure, that animals had done the rest. They didn't mention the gouges we'd photographed on the shelter, or explain how his backpack ended up torn apart in front of it, or what had tried to break in while we were inside. They definitely didn't explain what we heard that night. Jason and I don't really talk anymore, not because we had a falling out or anything, but because every conversation eventually circles back to that night, and neither of us wants to go there. He moved to Arizona a few months later, said he needed more sun, but I think he just wanted to get far away from forests and rain. I still live in Pennsylvania, got a job at an accounting firm that's about as far from outdoor adventure as you can get. Sometimes I'll see a missing hiker report on the news and my chest gets tight, wondering if they'll be found the way Kevin was found. I did some research after we got back, spent way too many nights going down rabbit holes about that particular stretch of trail. Turns out there have been 6 disappearances in that area over the past 15 years, all solo hikers, all during or right after bad weather. The bodies they found were always attributed to exposure or wildlife, but the ones they didn't find, well, those just stayed mysteries. Here's what keeps me up at night. Whatever was out there knew exactly what it was doing. The way it circled the shelter, tested for weaknesses, worked at the boards with tools. That wasn't some rabid animal or confused bear. It was intelligent, patient, methodical, and it had been watching Kevin Hartwell for who knows how long before it got him. Maybe it had been watching us too, waiting for one of us to step outside to use the bathroom or check out a noise. The only thing that saved us was staying put until daylight. I've never told anyone this part, but when we were packing up to leave that morning, I found something pressed into the mud right by where I'd been sleeping. A handprint, clear as day, but wrong. The fingers were too long, maybe 8 inches each, and there were only 3 of them plus what might have been a thumb. Jason was already heading down the trail, so I just stared at it for a second, then kicked mud over it and ran after him. Some things you just don't need to share, you know. Some things are better left covered up. The solitude was exactly what I needed. After defending my master's thesis on alpine lichen populations that May, I'd been crashing between university housing and my sister's cramped studio in Portland, sending out PhD applications and feeling like my life had stalled completely. When the Forest Service posted an opening for a week-long data collection assignment at the Cascade Ridge Monitoring Station, I didn't hesitate. The pay was garbage, but it came with field experience hours and a recommendation letter I desperately needed for my applications. More importantly, 7 days alone in the mountains sounded like absolute heaven compared to Emily's snoring and her boyfriend's gaming marathons that lasted until dawn. I loaded my Subaru on a Wednesday afternoon, drove 6 hours northeast into the Cascades, and felt something tight in my chest finally loosen when I reached the trailhead parking lot. Empty except for a rusted pickup that looked like it had been there since the Clinton administration. The hike up took most of Thursday, my pack crammed with sample jars, a week's worth of freeze-dried meals, 2 novels I'd been meaning to read, and probably too much camera gear. The station sat in a small clearing at 7,200 feet. Nothing fancy, just a weathered plywood cabin about 12 by 12 with a corrugated metal roof. Solar panels were bolted to the south-facing wall, and a satellite dish perched on top of a rickety tower made from 2x4s and prayer. Inside was bare bones. Military surplus cot with a musty sleeping bag, propane camping stove, folding table, lockbox containing the research equipment, and a battery backup system that supposedly charged during daylight hours. The Forest Service manual I'd skimmed said the satellite phone was temperamental, only worked if you stood in the exact center of the clearing and held it at a specific angle, but it was meant to be reliable enough for daily check-ins with the ranger station down in the valley. I spent that first evening collecting samples, scraping lichen off granite and logging coordinates, watching the sunset turn the ridgeline into something out of a painting. That night I slept harder than I had in months, the kind of unconscious, dreamless sleep that only comes when the nearest person is over 20 miles away, and there's nothing but wilderness between you and them. Friday and Saturday passed in a comfortable rhythm. Up at dawn, oatmeal and instant coffee on the propane stove, then out to the sampling sites with my GPS unit and collection kit. The work was methodical and peaceful, exactly the kind of mind-numbing routine I needed after months of thesis stress. I'd crouch on the rocks for hours, scraping samples into labeled vials, taking photos, recording notes in my waterproof field book. The weather held, clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s during the day, dropping to the 40s at night. I did my check-ins with the ranger station both mornings, standing in the clearing with the satellite phone held high like some kind of ritual offering to the telecommunications gods. A guy named Vincent answered both times, bored and friendly, asking about weather conditions and wildlife sightings. Everything completely routine. On Saturday evening, I allowed myself the luxury of heating extra water for a wash, stripped down in the cabin, and wiped myself clean with a bandana, feeling almost human again. I ate my rehydrated beef stroganoff, watching the stars come out, so many of them without any light pollution, thick as spilled salt across the black sky. Sunday started normal enough, but by mid-morning I noticed the wind picking up, clouds rolling in from the west in dark, heavy formations that made the temperature drop 10 degrees in an hour. I'd checked the forecast before leaving Portland, and it had called for clear weather all week, but mountain conditions change fast and forecasts mean nothing up here. By noon, the first drops were hitting, fat and cold, and I hustled back to the cabin with my sample kit. The storm hit hard around 2 in the afternoon, rain coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see the tree line from the cabin window. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough that I could feel it in my chest, and the whole structure shuddered with each gust of wind. I wasn't particularly worried at first. The cabin was solid enough and I'd weathered plenty of storms during field work, but then around 4, I heard a metallic screech followed by a crash that made me jump. I cracked the door open and saw the satellite dish tower had snapped halfway up, the dish itself dangling by its cables and spinning in the wind. The solar panels were still attached, but one had a spiderweb crack across its surface. I grabbed the satellite phone from the lockbox and stood in the clearing, rain soaking through my jacket in seconds, holding the phone up at every possible angle. Nothing. No signal, no dial tone, just dead air and the screen blinking no satellite connection in accusatory letters. The rational part of my brain tried to stay calm. The storm would pass, probably by morning. Vincent would notice when I missed my Monday check-in and send someone up the trail to investigate. Standard protocol. I had enough food for the rest of the week if I was careful. Plenty of water from the creek nearby, and the propane stove still worked fine. The solar panels were damaged, but the battery backup showed half charge, enough to keep my headlamp and phone powered for days if I was conservative. I went back inside, peeled off my soaked jacket, and tried to focus on my field notes, updating my sample logs by the light of my headlamp as the storm raged outside. But as evening crept in and the cabin grew darker, that rational voice got quieter. I kept thinking about the hike out, 23 miles of narrow trail that crossed 2 ridgelines, and a creek that was probably raging by now with all this rain. Even if the storm cleared, the trail would be a muddy disaster, potentially washed out in sections, and nobody knew I was in trouble yet. Nobody would know until Monday morning at the earliest, and even then, how long would it take them to organize a hike up here to check on me? Monday came with clear skies and an eerie silence, like the mountain was holding its breath. I did my morning routine on autopilot, rationing my oatmeal to make it last longer, boiling creek water since I'd burned through half my purified supply. The battery backup was down to 20%. Tried the satellite phone again, same result, and spent an hour in the clearing turning in slow circles with it held overhead like an idiot, hoping for even a flicker of signal. Nothing. The cracked solar panel was definitely dead, the other one still seemed functional, but the overcast sky meant it was barely charging anything. I busied myself with sample collection, trying to stick to the research schedule, but my mind kept wandering to logistics. If Vincent sent someone up, earliest they could arrive would be Tuesday afternoon, maybe Wednesday if they waited to see if I'd just missed one check-in. I had 4 freeze-dried meals left, maybe 5 if I stretched portions. The propane canister was half full. Water wasn't a problem as long as the creek kept running. I could make it work. I had to make it work. That evening I stood outside the cabin as the sun set, watching shadows stretch across the valley, and for the first time since arriving I felt the weight of how alone I actually was up here. Not peaceful alone, but vulnerable alone. The kind that makes you aware of every sound and movement in the darkening woods. I went to bed early to conserve my headlamp battery, lying in the sleeping bag with my pocket knife open beside me, which felt both ridiculous and necessary. Sleep came in fits and starts, my brain refusing to shut down completely, cycling through worst-case scenarios and probability calculations. Around what must have been 11 or midnight, I was in that shallow half-sleep state when I heard it. An engine. Distant at first, then growing louder, the distinct rumble of a vehicle grinding up a rough road. My eyes snapped open and I lay there perfectly still, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There was no road up here, not really. Just that old logging track that branched off the main trail about 2 miles down, overgrown and barely passable. I'd seen it on the map, but the Forest Service manual specifically said it was closed, impassable without a high-clearance 4-wheel drive. And even then it was discouraged because of erosion issues. But someone was driving it. The engine sound grew closer, then stopped abruptly, maybe a quarter mile away based on how the sound carried in the thin mountain air. I waited for voices, for doors slamming, for any indication of who it was or why they were here. Silence. Just the wind moving through the pines and my own breathing, too fast and shallow. I should have gotten up, should have grabbed my headlamp and gone to investigate, called out to whoever it was. Maybe it was a ranger coming to check on me, or another researcher, or some local who knew the back roads and had legitimate business up here. But something kept me pinned to that cot, some animal instinct that said, stay quiet, stay hidden, wait. Minutes stretched out like hours. I heard nothing else, no footsteps, no voices, no engines starting back up. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under into a fitful, anxious sleep, the kind where you're not sure if you're dreaming or awake. When I opened my eyes again, it was dawn, gray light filtering through the cabin's single window. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, some stress-induced auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and worry. Then I sat up and saw that the cabin door was open. Not wide open, just cracked about 6 inches, letting in a cold draft. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. I'd locked that door before bed. I was absolutely certain of it. The simple hook-and-eye latch that I'd fastened because it made me feel marginally safer. But now it hung loose, the door slightly ajar, moving just barely in the morning breeze. I forced myself out of the sleeping bag, legs shaking as I crossed the cabin and pushed the door fully open. The clearing looked normal in the pale morning light, undisturbed, the damaged satellite tower still listing at its broken angle. Then I saw it. A work glove, brown canvas with leather reinforcement on the palm, placed deliberately on top of a flat boulder about 10 feet from the cabin door. Not dropped, not lost, but positioned there with clear intention. Fingers spread slightly like it was waving. I walked toward it slowly, my breath coming in short bursts, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Boot prints, larger than mine, pressed into the soft mud around the clearing from last night's rain. They came from the direction of the logging road, approached the cabin, circled it once, then led back the way they'd come. Whoever it was had walked a complete loop around the structure while I slept inside. They'd touched the door, opened it, could have walked right in if they wanted to. Instead, they'd left the glove and walked away. I grabbed the glove with trembling fingers, turning it over like it might contain some explanation. It was damp from the night air, worn but not ancient, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store. No identifying marks, no monogram, nothing. I looked back at the boot prints, trying to read something in them, some clue about who'd been here and what they wanted. The prints were methodical, evenly spaced, the gait of someone moving with purpose and confidence in the dark. They didn't stumble or waver. Whoever this was knew exactly what they were doing. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing where they disappeared into the tree line, heading back toward the old logging road. Part of me wanted to follow them, to track down whoever had invaded my space and demand answers. But a stronger part screamed at me to stay put, to not go into those woods alone and exposed. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door even though the lock now felt meaningless, and dumped the contents of my pack onto the cot. The canister of bear spray I'd brought rolled out, along with my knife, my whistle, the emergency flare the Forest Service required me to carry. I arranged them on the folding table like talismans, objects that might protect me even though logically I knew they were nearly useless against another person who meant harm. The rest of Tuesday passed in a state of hyper-vigilant terror I'd never experienced before. Every crack of a branch, every bird call, every shift in the wind made my pulse spike. I couldn't focus on samples or field notes, couldn't think about anything except those boot prints and that glove, and the fact that someone had stood outside the cabin watching me sleep. I tried the satellite phone every hour with increasingly desperate movements, climbing onto the cabin roof at one point to get higher elevation, but the result never changed. By afternoon, I'd made a decision. Staying here was insane. Waiting for rescue meant giving whoever this was more opportunities to come back, and next time, they might not just leave a glove. The trail would be rough after the storm, possibly dangerous in sections, but it was my only option. I'd leave at first light Wednesday, push hard, and try to cover the 23 miles in one brutal day, rather than the leisurely 2-day pace I'd taken coming up. I spent the evening packing, organizing my gear, forcing down a freeze-dried meal I could barely taste. I wedged the folding chair under the door handle as an extra barrier, kept the bear spray in my sleeping bag with me, and lay there in the dark, listening to every sound outside. Sleep came in 20-minute increments, shallow and full of nightmares about footsteps and hands reaching through the doorway. Wednesday morning, I was up before dawn, shoving the last items into my pack by headlamp light, hands moving fast and clumsy with adrenaline. I did one final check of the cabin, made sure I had the GPS unit, water filter, first aid kit, all the essentials. The forest was still dark when I stepped outside, closing the door behind me for the last time. That's when I saw them. Fresh boot prints in the clearing, the same tread pattern as before, except these had been made recently, probably while I was inside packing. They came from the logging road direction again, approached within 15 feet of the cabin door, and then stopped. Just stopped. Like whoever it was had stood there watching the cabin, watching the light from my headlamp moving inside the windows. Then the prints turned and walked away, back into the trees. I didn't wait to analyze them further. I hit the trail at a near run, my overladen pack bouncing painfully against my back, moving as fast as the narrow path and pre-dawn darkness allowed. For the first hour, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone following, but the trail stayed empty. As the sun rose and I put more distance between myself and that clearing, the panic started to shift into something else, a grim determination to just keep moving, keep covering ground, get back to civilization and people and safety. I made it to the trailhead parking lot 13 hours later, legs screaming, feet blistered, completely exhausted but alive. My Subaru was exactly where I'd left it, untouched, and I'd never been so grateful to see that beat-up vehicle in my life. I drove straight to the ranger station, barely coherent as I tried to explain what happened to Vincent and his supervisor. They took it seriously, I'll give them that. Vincent radioed another ranger to hike up and check the cabin, while his supervisor filed an incident report and asked me detailed questions about the vehicle I'd heard, the boot prints, everything. They found the glove where I'd left it on the table inside, bagged it as evidence. The boot prints were still visible, but rain that Wednesday afternoon washed away most of the detail before they could make proper casts. The supervisor told me they'd increase patrols on that old logging road, set up a trail camera near the cabin, and investigate whether any vehicles had been reported in that area. He was kind but honest, said without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond monitoring the situation. I never found out who it was. The Forest Service sent me updates for a few months after, mostly saying the trail camera hadn't captured anything unusual, and no other researchers reported problems at that station. Vincent told me during one phone call that they'd found tire tracks on the logging road that matched a common model of pickup truck, but that described half the vehicles in the county. Eventually, the emails stopped coming and I stopped checking. I finished my field report from the samples I'd collected, got my recommendation letter, and started a PhD program in September at a university in the Midwest, far from any mountains. I threw away the work glove after the Forest Service said they didn't need it anymore. Sometimes I still think about those boot prints circling the cabin, about how close that person got, about what they wanted, or what might have happened if I'd stayed another night. The rational explanations don't satisfy me, never have. Maybe it was a squatter using the logging road, someone who got spooked when they realized the cabin was occupied. Maybe it was a local playing a cruel joke, or some creep who got off on intimidating women alone in the woods. I don't know. What I do know is that I never went back to that station, turned down every field assignment that involved solo work in isolated locations, and I sleep better now knowing there are neighbors within shouting distance. Some experiences change how you see solitude, and mine taught me that being alone isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it just makes you an easier target. Driving long-haul trucks wasn't what I imagined myself doing when I turned 33, but after the divorce papers were signed in 2017, I needed something that would keep me moving. Hendrick Transport hired me 6 months later, and I've been hauling freight across the Northwest ever since. Most runs blur together after a while. Same stretches of highway, same truck stops, same greasy food. But there's one trip I can't forget. One that changed how I see every rest area, every roadside sign, every dark parking lot off the interstate. It happened on a Wednesday in late November 2022, and I'm only sharing this now because I saw something on the news last week that made my stomach turn. I need to get this out there, even if nobody believes me. I'd been on the road for 9 hours that night, hauling refrigerated produce from Spokane down to Boise. The route was familiar. I'd driven it maybe 30 times before, but an accident near Coeur d'Alene had backed up traffic for almost 2 hours and threw off my whole schedule. By the time I cleared it, my eyes were burning and my back was killing me. I should have pulled over earlier, but I kept pushing, convinced I could make up the time. The sun had been down for hours and the temperature outside had dropped into the teens. That brutal kind of cold that makes your cab feel like a tin can even with the heat blasting. My fuel gauge sat just above a quarter tank, plenty to reach the next town, but my bladder was telling a different story. That's so when I spotted it through the darkness, a hand-painted wooden sign lit up with yellow bulbs strung around the edges. Rest area, 2 miles, home-cooked meals, open late. The promise of hot food and a bathroom was enough to make me flip my turn signal. The exit came up fast, a narrow turnoff that curved sharply into the trees. No streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the dense pine forest on both sides. The road was rougher than I expected, cracked asphalt that made my trailer bounce and rattle behind me. I downshifted and took it slow, wondering why the state would let a rest area get this run down. Usually these places are maintained pretty well, especially on routes that see heavy truck traffic, but I figured maybe it was one of those unofficial spots, the kind that locals know about but doesn't show up on GPS. I'd seen a few of those over the years. The road curved for maybe half a mile before opening up into a clearing, and that's when I got my first real look at the place. It wasn't what I expected at all. The clearing was bigger than most rest areas, maybe the size of a football field, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. There were no lights except for a single buzzing fluorescent fixture mounted on a wooden pole in the center, casting this sickly yellow glow over everything. I could see 3 other big rigs parked in a loose cluster near the far end, their cabs dark and silent. No idling engines, no lights, nothing. That struck me as odd right away because truckers usually keep their engines running at night for heat, especially in weather this cold. Off to the left was a small wooden building, maybe 20 feet across, with a hand-painted sign that read "Restrooms and Food" in that same amateur style as the highway sign. The paint was peeling, and the whole structure looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. There was a dim light glowing inside, warm and orange like a kerosene lamp, and I could see condensation on the windows. The whole setup felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I pulled my rig into a spot about 50 feet from the building, keeping some distance between myself and those other trucks. Force of habit, I guess. I set the air brake and killed the engine, instantly regretting it when the cold started seeping in through the door seals. I sat there for a minute just watching. Nobody moved in or around the building. The other trucks stayed dark and silent. I checked my phone, no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. The clock read 11:47 p.m. I grabbed my jacket from behind the seat and my flashlight from the door pocket, one of those heavy mag lights that doubles as a weapon if you need it to. The cold hit me like a wall when I opened the door, that sharp mountain air that stings your lungs. My boots crunched on gravel mixed with patches of frozen snow as I walked toward the building. The fluorescent pole light buzzed louder as I got closer, flickering every few seconds. I could smell something cooking, onions maybe, or some kind of stew. It actually smelled good, which eased my nerves a little bit. The door to the building was solid wood, old and heavy, with a metal handle that was ice cold to the touch. I pulled it open and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that hit my face. The interior was one room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a counter along the back wall and 4 small tables with mismatched chairs scattered around. An older woman stood behind the counter, maybe 60 or 65, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a floral apron over a thick sweater and was stirring something in a large pot on a camping stove. She looked up when I entered and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evening, hun," she said, her voice gravelly like a lifetime smoker. "Cold one tonight. You hungry?" I nodded and approached the counter, noticing that the restroom door in the corner had a padlock on it. "Bathroom's out of order," she said quickly, following my gaze. "Pipes burst last week. There's an outhouse around back if you need it." That didn't make sense. If the pipes burst, why was she cooking with water? But I was too tired to question it. I asked what she had to eat and she gestured to the pot. "Beef stew. Made it fresh this afternoon. $8 for a bowl and some bread." The price was reasonable and my stomach was growling, so I pulled out my wallet. That's when I heard it. A sharp metallic sound from outside, like a chain being dragged across gravel. The woman's eyes flickered toward the window behind me for just a split second, before she looked back down at her pot. "That'll be cash only," she said, her voice a little tighter now. I handed her a 10 and she made change from a cigar box under the counter, her movements quick and mechanical. As she ladled stew into a foam bowl, I turned to glance out the window. What I saw made my appetite vanish instantly. Two men had appeared near my truck, both wearing dark jackets and baseball caps pulled low. One was walking around my rig, shining a flashlight into the cab windows. The other was doing something near my fuel tanks. I couldn't see clearly through the dirty window, but the way they moved, coordinated and deliberate, sent alarm bells screaming in my head. "Those guys friends of yours?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. The woman didn't look up. "Don't know what you mean, hun. Here's your stew." I didn't take the bowl. My brain was working overtime now, piecing things together. The dark trucks with no engines running, the locked bathroom, this woman alone in the middle of nowhere, the way she kept glancing at the door. "Actually, I need to use that outhouse first," I said, backing toward the exit. She finally looked at me, and this time there was something calculating in her expression, like she was deciding something. "Might want to eat while it's hot," she said, but I was already pushing through the door. The cold air hit me again, but I barely noticed. I walked quickly toward my truck, my hand gripping the maglite tight. The two men had moved. They were now standing near the other parked rigs, and as I got closer, I could see 3 more figures emerging from behind the trailers. All men, all dressed in dark clothes, all watching me. My rig was about 40 feet away. The exit road was another 100 feet beyond that, and I could see now that someone had parked the old pickup truck sideways across it, blocking the way out. My heart was hammering, but I kept walking, trying to look calm. One of the men started moving toward me, casual at first, then faster. I didn't run. Running would have sealed it. Instead, I picked up my pace just enough to reach my cab door before he closed the distance. I yanked it open and hauled myself up in one motion, slamming the door and hitting the lock. The man reached my truck 2 seconds later, grabbing the handle and pulling hard. He wasn't wearing a mask, and I got a clear look at his face through the window. Mid-40s beard, dead calm expression. He wasn't yelling or threatening. He just stood there pulling the handle rhythmically, like he had all the time in the world. That scared me more than anything. I twisted the key and the engine turned over, thank God, roaring to life. I released the air brake and threw it into gear. The man outside stepped back and pulled something from his jacket. I saw the glint of metal, a tire iron or crowbar. 2 more men were running toward my passenger side now. I had maybe 3 seconds before they surrounded me completely. The pickup blocking the exit was old, a Ford from the 90s by the look of it. I did the math in my head. My rig fully loaded weighed about 35,000 pounds. That truck weighed maybe 4,000. I gunned the engine and aimed straight for it, no hesitation. The men scattered as I picked up speed, 20 miles per hour, then 30. I heard shouting behind me and something metal clanged off my trailer. The pickup grew larger in my headlights. At the last second, I saw someone in the driver's seat scramble out and dive clear. Then I hit it. The impact jolted through my entire body, my seatbelt cutting hard across my chest. The truck's rear end lifted and spun sideways with a screech of tearing metal. My rig bucked and shuddered but kept moving, pushing through. The pickup's bed crumpled like tin foil, and then I was past it, accelerating hard down the exit road. My mirrors showed chaos behind me. Men running, flashlight beams swinging wildly, someone throwing something that bounced off my doors. Then the trees closed in and they disappeared from view. I drove like hell for 20 minutes straight, not slowing down until I hit the main highway and saw other traffic. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline making my vision swim. I pulled into the first legitimate truck stop I found, a Flying J just outside Lewiston, and parked under the brightest lights I could find. I sat there for a good 10 minutes just breathing, checking my mirrors every few seconds. Then I called 911. The dispatcher took my report and patched me through to Idaho State Police. I told them everything. The fake rest area sign, the blocked exit, the men. They said they'd send units to investigate and took down my information. A trooper called me back 3 hours later while I was still parked at the Flying J, too wired to sleep. He said they'd found the location. The building was abandoned, no woman inside, no camping stove, nothing. Just an empty room with trash on the floor. The pickup I'd rammed was gone. No other trucks in the clearing. He said it looked like someone had swept the gravel to hide tire tracks. They found the fake sign, though, already torn down and tossed in the ditch. The trooper told me to file a formal report when I got to Boise, which I did. For weeks I heard nothing. Then, in January, about 6 weeks after it happened, a detective called me. He said they'd connected my incident to a string of disappearances along that corridor. Truckers who'd gone missing over the past 2 years. 4 confirmed cases, maybe more. All independent drivers, the kind without dispatch tracking their every move. They'd found one of the missing trucks stripped and abandoned near the Canadian border. The detective said my report had finally given them enough to start piecing it together. Apparently that rest area had been shut down by the state back in 2012, but someone had been maintaining the fake signs and luring drivers in. They suspected it was an organized crew hitting trucks for cargo and whatever cash the drivers carried. And based on the disappearances, they weren't leaving witnesses. The investigation is still ongoing. Last week I saw a news report that they'd made 3 arrests in connection with the case. When they showed the mugshots, I recognized one face immediately. The man with the beard who'd pulled my door handle, still wearing that same dead calm expression. I still drive for Hendrick, still haul the same routes, but I'm different now. I don't care how badly I need to piss or how hungry I am. I will never pull into an unmarked rest area again. I keep my phone charged, my fuel tank above half, and I trust my gut when something feels wrong. The detective told me I was lucky, that my decision to ram through that barricade probably saved my life. He said most of the missing drivers were found to have stopped their engines and gotten out of their cabs, just like I almost did. Sometimes I think about those other trucks I saw parked in that clearing, dark and silent in the cold. I wonder if the drivers were already gone by the time I arrived, or if they were nearby watching, waiting to see if I'd be stupid enough to stay. I'll never know. What I do know is that comfort and routine can kill you out here. That hand-painted sign looked harmless, almost charming. The woman seemed like somebody's grandmother, but that's exactly how they wanted it to look. I'm sharing this because I want every driver out there to know that this stuff is real. It's not an urban legend or some campfire story. There are people who see trucks as moving ATMs full of cargo and cash, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. Pay attention to the details, trust your instincts, and if something feels even slightly wrong, get the hell out. Those extra miles to a real truck stop might save your life. The Smoky Mountains had always been my favorite place to disappear for a few days. I was working on a photography piece for a small outdoor magazine, trying to capture early spring fog rolling over the ridges. My life back then was simple. I'd drive my old pickup from one national park to another, sleep in the back, and send my editor shots whenever I found something worth keeping. That week had been quiet. Cold mornings, a few deer, and the kind of silence that settles so deep you start hearing your own heartbeat echo inside your head. On my 3rd day, I hiked up to a ridge near Klingman's Dome before sunrise. The fog was thick enough that my flashlight beam looked like it was hitting a wall. I remember the ground being slick, mud clinging to my boots, and that strange burnt wood smell that sometimes lingers after lightning storms. Around 8 a.m., I finally reached an open spot where the trees thinned out, giving me a view of endless gray ridges dissolving into the mist. I set up my tripod, took a few test shots, and felt that familiar calm I only ever got when I was alone in places like this. A little after noon, I took a break and checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising that high up, but I noticed something odd, faint footprints in the mud behind my setup. Not mine. They were deeper, wider, and pointed slightly uphill, like someone had been standing just above me for a while. I brushed it off at first, assuming another hiker had passed earlier, but when I followed the prints with my eyes, they stopped abruptly near a cluster of mossy rocks, as if the person had vanished mid-step. The air around me suddenly felt heavier, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept shooting for another hour, trying to shake it off. Every few minutes I'd turn around, pretending to adjust my gear, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. At one point I thought I heard movement, a faint crunch of leaves coming from the slope behind me. But the fog made direction useless. I called out, "Hello?" And my own voice came back strange, muffled, like the trees swallowed it whole. That's when I decided to pack up early and head down the ridge. Before I left, I snapped one last picture of the clearing, just because the light looked eerie enough to be interesting. By the time I started descending, the fog had thickened again, and the trail looked unfamiliar. I'd hiked that ridge before, but every turn seemed steeper, narrower, like the mountain was rearranging itself. I checked my GPS, but it wouldn't load. I tried my phone again and got a single flicker of signal, just enough to text my friend Ryan. "Think someone's following me on the ridge." It sent, and then the bars disappeared. I remember staring at the screen for a long second, wondering if I sounded paranoid. But the truth was, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, matching mine whenever I stopped. I began walking faster, half sliding down the slope, my camera bag slamming against my back. The forest was quiet except for the wind pushing through the branches, but every so often, I'd hear that same sound. Someone taking a step and pausing when I did. I turned more than once, scanning between the trees, trying to catch movement. Nothing. Just the fog shifting, tree trunks stacked like ghosts, and the faint outline of something darker between them that always seemed to vanish when I blinked. At one point, I reached a fallen log and sat for a minute to catch my breath. The air had that damp chill that seeps through your clothes, and I could taste iron, like rain mixed with metal. I glanced downslope and saw something half buried near the base of a tree, a torn piece of blue fabric, maybe from a jacket. I thought it might have been mine from the last trip, but when I picked it up, it was warm, not body warm, but as if someone had been holding it recently. That was the moment I decided to leave the ridge completely and cut across toward the service road, even if it meant bushwhacking through thick brush. The forest got darker much faster than I expected. The light turned that strange blue-gray that happens before dusk, and every sound seemed to stretch. A branch snapping miles away, an owl calling twice. I tripped once, caught myself on a sapling and realized I was standing near a steep drop, maybe 30 feet down. When I looked over the edge, I could just make out my own tripod still standing where I'd left it earlier. I hadn't even noticed I'd circled back to the same spot. That's when the unease hit me hard, like I was being led, not lost. I took a few careful steps back from the edge, trying to steady my breathing. The fog had thinned just enough for me to see faint shapes between the trees, but they never fully came into focus. I wanted to believe it was just shadows, tricks of light, anything rational. But then, from the exact spot where my tripod stood below, I heard the sound of the shutter clicking. Once, then again. Slow, deliberate. My camera was still down there, but it was being used. Whoever had been on the ridge hadn't left. I shouted, half hoping it was another hiker, maybe a ranger messing with my gear, but no one answered. I started down the slope, sliding on the mud, grabbing roots to keep balance. When I reached the bottom, the tripod was on its side. My camera dangled by its strap, lens caked in dirt. I checked the playback screen. The battery was almost dead, but one new photo had been taken after the ones I'd shot earlier. I opened it, and for a second I didn't understand what I was seeing. The picture was angled slightly upward, showing the mist and tree line. And at the bottom edge, out of focus but unmistakable, was a pair of muddy boots standing right behind where I should have been. The woods were dead silent after that. I grabbed the camera, slung it over my shoulder, and bolted toward the service road. I didn't stop until I saw the outline of my truck through the trees, headlights catching in the fog as the automatic lights switched on. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there for what felt like an hour before driving back to town. My phone lit up just once with Ryan's text, "Who's following you?" But by then, I didn't want to answer. I didn't even want to look at the message again. That night, I dropped the camera off at my editor's office and told him I was done with the assignment. He called 2 days later saying one of the park rangers had found my tripod and thought I'd gone missing. He sounded confused when I told him I was fine. When I asked about the photo, he hesitated and said there wasn't one on the memory card. It must have been corrupted. I haven't been back to the Smokies since. Every so often, though, when I scroll through old photos, I still pause on that Ridge series, half expecting to see those same muddy boots standing just behind me again. I moved up to that cabin about 2 years ago, thinking I'd finally found some peace. It sat near the edge of a small mountain town in northern Colorado, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest grocery store. I worked remotely as a surveyor for a construction firm, so being off the grid wasn't a problem. My only company most nights were my 2 dogs, Murphy and Scout, both mutts, both loud enough to scare off anything that wandered too close. The place had that kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough, the kind of silence that used to feel comforting. Used to. That night, or more accurately early morning, I was pulled out of sleep by Murphy's deep growl echoing through the cabin. It was around 3 a.m., and Scout had already jumped down from the couch and planted herself by the sliding glass door that faced the tree line. Their hackles were up, teeth bared toward the dark. I figured maybe a coyote had wandered too close, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped closer. I didn't open the door, though, just watched through the glass, waiting to see what had them so spooked. Then, clear as day, came this slow whistle from somewhere in the trees. Not random, not casual. It had rhythm, like a tune someone was repeating on purpose. The kind of whistle people use when they want you to know they're there. My first thought was that some drunk hiker had gotten lost, but something about the way it carried through the air didn't sit right. It was deliberate, taunting almost. I stood there barefoot on the cold wood floor, while the sound faded and came back again from a different spot, like whoever it was moving along the tree line. After a minute or two, the dogs went quiet, almost like they were waiting for a command that never came. I stayed there another 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark between the trunks, but there was nothing. No movement, no eye shine, just the forest swallowing that last echo of the whistle. Eventually, I told myself it was probably some local messing around, and I went back to bed, though I didn't really sleep again after that. When daylight came, everything felt smaller and less threatening. I made coffee, fed the dogs, and tried to laugh it off. But when I stepped outside to let them run, something immediately caught my eye near the back porch. Right along the fence line, half buried in the damp dirt, were 3 cigarette butts pressed into the mud. Not old either. The paper wasn't even fully discolored. I crouched down, picked one up between 2 fingers, and nearly dropped it. It was still warm. Someone had been standing there watching the house not long before dawn. I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the snow patches that hadn't melted yet. There were faint footprints, only partial, leading toward the trees but fading before the slope. No tire marks, no trail of ash, nothing that pointed to a vehicle. Just those smudged outlines and the memory of that whistle looping in my head. Murphy kept sniffing around one particular spot by the fence, whining softly like he still smelled whoever had been there. That's when it hit me how close that person had been, less than 20 feet from where I slept. The rest of the day dragged. I couldn't focus on work. I kept glancing at the window every few minutes. Around noon, I decided to set up a motion sensor light facing the woods, the cheap kind you get from the hardware store. I figured if whoever it was came back, I'd at least have a heads up. But as evening settled in, the quiet returned, heavier than usual. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that mountain isolation can mess with your sense of safety. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting by the window with the lights off, the dogs lying quietly beside me. The moonlight spilled across the clearing, pale and steady, and I thought maybe I'd scared myself for nothing. But around 2:45 a.m., Murphy lifted his head and gave this low, uncertain growl. I held my breath. Then, just like the night before, the whistle started again. Same slow, mocking rhythm, but this time closer. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from the other side of the fence. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there, barely breathing, listening as the sound drifted along the fence like someone pacing slowly behind it. The whistle would stop for a few seconds, then start again, lower and rougher, like whoever it was had a dry throat. Murphy pressed against my leg, trembling, and Scout stood by the door, staring through the glass with her ears flat. I finally grabbed the rifle I kept above the mantel, mostly for bears, and stepped quietly toward the back door. I didn't open it. I just raised the barrel enough to let whoever was out there know I wasn't helpless. The whistling stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, there was nothing but wind moving through the pines. Then came a soft crunch of boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, walking away. I waited until the sound disappeared entirely before flicking on the porch light. The beam stretched just far enough to catch a faint trail of breath in the cold air, human breath, dissipating like smoke, and then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, gun still in my hand, feeling the weight of the silence settle over the cabin again. At sunrise, I went out back with the dogs and checked the ground. The motion light hadn't triggered, but there were clear footprints this time, bigger than mine, heavier, and they circled the fence line like the person had been walking back and forth for hours. I followed them until they disappeared into the woods, where I found a crushed beer can and a torn piece of flannel snagged on a branch. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been out there watching me, maybe even testing how far they could go before I reacted. I filed a report with the sheriff's office later that morning, but the deputy who came out looked tired, like he'd heard it all before. He said they'd patrol the area and told me to keep my doors locked. That was weeks ago and no one's been caught. I still live in that cabin, but I've stopped sleeping through the night. Every now and then the dogs start growling at the dark, and I find myself staring toward the trees again, waiting for that whistle. It hasn't come back yet, but I keep the porch light on anyway. I used to work as a seasonal park ranger in the Appalachian Highlands, back when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. It was one of those jobs you take because you love the quiet, endless trails, the smell of pine, the sound of wind through the trees that never really stops. The ranger station where I was assigned sat about 2 hours from the nearest town, perched on a slope that overlooked miles of dense forest. The area had a few old landmarks scattered around, mostly abandoned cabins and fire lookouts from the 1960s that no one bothered to maintain anymore. That morning started like any other. I checked weather logs, restocked the first aid kits, and made a note to clear a few fallen branches off one of the hiking routes. Around 10 a.m., the radio crackled with static before dispatch came through. Someone had called in from the lower valley, reporting a column of smoke rising near the ridge where the old Fairpoint Lookout used to stand. That tower had been decommissioned for decades. I'd seen it once, just a rusted frame and a few rotting boards left. Still, I grabbed my pack, told the other ranger on duty, Matt, that I'd check it out, and headed toward the trailhead. The hike took longer than I remembered. The trail was overgrown, roots coiling across the path like veins, and everything smelled damp and old. The air had that kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're walking into a place that doesn't want to be disturbed. About halfway up, I noticed faint boot prints in the mud. They weren't old, the edges were sharp, and the rain from the night before hadn't blurred them. Whoever had been there couldn't have left more than a few hours earlier. I radioed Matt, but the signal cut out almost immediately, which wasn't unusual up there. Still, I remember feeling a small knot of unease in my chest. By the time I reached the lookout clearing, the air had turned heavy and gray. The structure looked like it might collapse under its own weight. Wooden beams splintered, the roof half caved in, metal rails orange with rust. But what caught my eye wasn't the tower itself. It was the thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney of the small ranger's shack beside it. I stopped dead for a moment, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Just that faint hiss of burning wood. The place had no power, no reason for anyone to be there. I remember thinking maybe a hiker had taken shelter overnight, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I approached the shack slowly, calling out a quick, "Hello," just to make sure whoever was inside wouldn't mistake me for an intruder. No response. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the hinges gave a dry groan. Inside, it smelled of smoke and old paper, that thick, musty scent that lingers in forgotten places. A small iron stove in the corner still glowed faintly red, heat rippling above it. Someone had been there recently, maybe within the last hour. There was a tin mug on the counter with a thin film of coffee, still steaming. My heartbeat picked up, not from fear exactly, but from that instinct that tells you something isn't adding up. The interior looked like it had been untouched for decades otherwise. Old ranger gear sat in piles, an outdated radio, waterlogged maps, a cracked lantern. On the desk near the window, I noticed a torn piece of paper weighed down by a rock. It was a single page from a field log, yellowed but clean, not brittle like you'd expect from something left that long. The date at the top stopped me cold. The same day, the same month, but 30 years earlier. I thought it was some kind of prank at first, maybe a coincidence, until I saw the handwriting. The name signed at the bottom was Ranger Ellis Moore. I knew that name. Everyone at the station did. He was the ranger who'd vanished during a storm in the early 1990s while on patrol near this very ridge. I stood there for a long minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of script that looked like someone had taken their time. The entry mentioned heavy fog rolling in from the east and a strange light spotted near the tree line. Then it ended abruptly, mid-sentence, like he'd been interrupted. I glanced out the grimy window, half expecting to see someone watching from the woods. The forest outside was still, unnaturally still. Even the birds were quiet. I told myself it was just the altitude playing tricks, that maybe someone was camping illegally and using the place as cover. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, charged. I walked around the back of the shack and saw a set of fresh boot prints leading away toward the tree line. The strange part was, they didn't match mine or Matt's standard ranger boots. The sole pattern was older, wider, like something from a design I hadn't seen in years. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they just stopped. The ground ahead was soft enough to leave impressions, but there was nothing. No prints, no drag marks, nothing to show which direction they'd gone. It was like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I went back to the shack, uneasy now, and tried the radio again. Static. I adjusted the dial, stepped outside, even climbed partway up the lookout ladder. But there was nothing but white noise. It wasn't unusual for the signal to drop this high up, but it felt different this time, like the interference had a pulse to it, faint, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I gave up and decided to hike back toward the main trail, figuring I could get a signal once I dropped a few hundred feet in elevation. Before leaving, I took one last look inside. The stove had gone cold already, though it had been hot to the touch less than 10 minutes earlier. As I shut the door, something caught my eye through the gap in the window. A reflection, or what I thought was one. There was a figure standing near the tree line, maybe 30 yards away. I could only make out the outline, tall, still, like a person standing perfectly straight with their hands at their sides. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, fatigue from the climb, anything that made sense. Still, I quickened my pace heading down the trail, keeping my flashlight out even though it was only mid-afternoon. The forest felt darker than before, shadows stretching longer than they should have. Halfway down, I started hearing footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, always keeping just enough distance that I couldn't see who or what it was. I called out again, louder this time, but the sound stopped immediately. The woods went silent in a way that makes your ears ring. I forced myself to keep walking, resisting the urge to turn around every few seconds. It felt like hours before I reached the clearing near the base of the ridge, where the old maintenance road began. That's when I finally caught a radio signal. Matt's voice came through, faint but clear enough. "You seen the smoke too?" I stopped in my tracks. "What smoke?" I asked, but he didn't respond right away. After a moment of static, he came back. "It's coming from your location, Tower Ridge. We can see it from here." I turned slowly, looking back up the mountain. Sure enough, a thin gray column was rising straight from the direction of the lookout, thicker now than before, like something big was burning. My heart sank. I'd just been there. There was nothing that could have caused a blaze like that. Without thinking, I started running back up the trail, against every bit of logic I had left. By the time I reached the clearing again, the smoke had thinned out, drifting like mist through the trees. The shack was still there, but the air smelled strange. Not like burning wood, more like heated metal and ozone. The stove was cold, the mug gone from the counter, and the torn log page wasn't on the desk anymore. I stood there breathing hard, sweat and rain mixing on my face, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined the entire thing. Then I noticed the old radio in the corner had turned on by itself, its tiny red light blinking. Through the static, I heard a man's voice, calm and steady, saying my name once. Just once, before cutting off completely. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically stumbled down the mountain, barely noticing the cuts on my hands or the branches scraping my arms. When I finally made it back to the station, Matt looked pale. He said the smoke had disappeared a few minutes after I radioed in. I told him what I saw, the prints, the stove, the page, and he just stared at me. Then he walked to the back room, came out with an old folder, and dropped it on the desk. Inside were copies of Ellis Moore's original field reports, including the one written on the same date, 30 years earlier. The last line matched exactly what I'd read in that shack, before it cut off mid-sentence. For the next few days, a team went up there to check the area. They found no recent fire damage, no signs of anyone camping, and no footprints except mine. The shack looked untouched, dust and cobwebs everywhere, as if no one had been inside for years. The radio that had turned on by itself, completely dead. The wiring corroded, battery long gone. Everyone tried to come up with explanations, but none of them made sense. I stopped trying to make sense of it too. Some things in those mountains just don't want to be understood. A few months later, I got transferred to another district. Before I left, I took one last look at the ridge through the station binoculars. The tower was just a silhouette against the morning haze. But as the light shifted, I could have sworn I saw someone standing beside it, still as stone, facing down the valley. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe not. All I know is, every year on that same date, someone reports smoke rising from the old Fairpoint lookout. No one goes up there anymore, not officially. And I've never been back. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Widowhood changes you in ways you never expect, and one of those changes was my decision to stay on the property Glenn and I had built together in rural Montana. He passed 2 winters before that night, and somewhere between burying him and turning 43, I convinced myself that staying made sense. Our nearest neighbors, the Farley family, lived about 3 miles down the county road, and the closest sheriff's substation was in Ridgefield, a good 50-minute drive on roads that turned treacherous after dark. People in the city think isolation sounds peaceful, romantic even, but there is nothing romantic about being a woman alone in a house surrounded by wheat fields and darkness that stretches in every direction. That particular night in early November 2017, I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted from splitting firewood and fixing a section of fence the wind had knocked down. My 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a mutt named Copper, slept in their usual spots by the wood stove. The wind had died down and the house had settled into that deep, consuming quiet that only exists miles away from civilization. I woke to Duke's growl, low and guttural, the kind of sound he only made when something was genuinely wrong. My eyes opened to complete darkness, and for a moment I lay still, listening, trying to separate real sounds from the remnants of whatever dream I had been having. Then Copper joined in, both dogs now at the bedroom window, their bodies rigid, hackles raised in silhouettes against the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I heard it then, distant but unmistakable, other dogs barking somewhere out in the night. The Farleys had hounds, and they never barked like that unless something had them spooked. I pushed myself up on one elbow, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand, when I saw it, a sweep of headlights moving slowly across my eastern field. Not on the road, but actually in the field, cutting through the harvested wheat stubble. My heart began pounding as I watched the lights move with purpose, methodical, like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Nobody had any business being on my property at. I checked the clock, 2:47 in the morning. I did not turn on the lamp. Some instinct, ancient and primal, told me to stay in the dark. Instead, I slid out of bed and crouched below the window, peering over the sill just enough to watch. The headlights had stopped moving now, parked at the edge of my property near the old grain silo. Glenn had never gotten around to tearing down. Then they went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the dogs growling and the distant sound of the Farley hounds still going wild. Then I saw a second set of headlights appear, coming from the opposite direction, from the west where the old logging road cut through the tree line. These lights also moved slowly, deliberately, and they also stopped at the perimeter of my property before going dark. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers finding it in the darkness, and I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and I immediately dimmed it, shielding the glow with my body. No signal. There was never good signal out here, but sometimes I could get one bar near the kitchen window. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, Duke and Copper following close behind me, their nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When I reached the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall beside the window that faced the front yard and the long gravel driveway that connected my property to the county road. What I saw made my legs go weak. A third vehicle was parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights also off, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. They had surrounded the house. 3 vehicles, positioned at 3 different points, and all of them had known exactly where to stop, exactly how to approach without being seen from the road. I checked my phone again, holding it up near the window, watching desperately for even one bar to appear. Nothing. I thought about the landline in the living room, the old rotary phone Glenn had insisted on keeping because cell service was so unreliable. I started moving toward it, staying low, when I heard something that stopped me cold, the distinct sound of a radio crackling somewhere outside, followed by a man's voice too quiet to make out the words, but close enough to hear the tone. I crawled to the living room, my knees scraping against the rug Glenn's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The rotary phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I lifted the receiver as quietly as I could, pressing it to my ear. Dead silence. No dial tone, nothing. They had cut the line. These were not drunk teenagers or lost hunters. These were people who had planned this, who knew that cutting the phone line would leave me stranded, who understood that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. I set the receiver down and pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. Glenn's shotgun was in the bedroom closet, a 12-gauge Remington he had taught me to use for coyotes that sometimes went after the chickens. I had not fired it since he died, but I knew it was loaded, knew there was a box of shells on the top shelf beside it. I needed to get back to the bedroom without being seen through any of the windows. Duke suddenly let out a sharp bark, and I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, whispering for him to be quiet. Through the living room window, I saw a beam of light sweep across the front porch. A flashlight. Someone was on my porch, right outside the front door, maybe 15 feet from where I was crouched in the darkness. I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, slow and deliberate, and then the light paused at the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold hardwood, holding both dogs by their collars as they trembled and growled. The beam moved across the room above me, illuminating the couch, the bookshelf, the fireplace mantel with our wedding photo still displayed. Then the light clicked off, and I heard the footsteps retreat, followed by that radio crackle again. A different voice this time, deeper, responded with something I could not understand. They were communicating positions, coordinating movements, and they were doing it with the kind of calm efficiency that terrified me more than anything else. I waited until the footsteps faded before I started crawling toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. Every creak of the floorboard sounded impossibly loud, and I kept expecting a window to shatter or a door to burst open at any moment. When I finally reached the bedroom, I eased the closet door open and felt around in the darkness until my fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded by touch alone, and grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. My hands were unsteady as I shoved extra shells into the pockets of my pajama pants. I had no plan beyond this, no idea what I was supposed to do against multiple armed men who clearly knew what they were doing. I thought about hiding, about crawling into the space beneath the bed or locking myself in the bathroom, but I knew that would only delay whatever was coming. These people had not gone through all this trouble just to leave empty-handed. They wanted something, and the only thing of value in this house was me. A sound from the back of the house made Duke lunge forward, barking furiously, and this time I could not stop him. He bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, Copper right behind him, and I heard the back door rattle violently in its frame. Someone was trying to force it open. I ran after the dogs, the shotgun raised, my bare feet slapping against the floor. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the door shaking as someone threw their weight against it from outside. The deadbolt was holding, but the door was old, the wood frame soft from decades of Montana winters. It would not hold for long. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door and screamed at the top of my lungs that I had a gun, that I would shoot anyone who came through. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I heard that radio crackle again, followed by a voice I will never forget as long as I live. It was calm, almost amused, and it said clearly enough for me to hear through the door. "She is in the kitchen, armed, 12 gauge, probably the husband's old Remington." They knew about Glenn. They knew about the gun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost doubled over. These were not strangers who had randomly chosen my house. These were people who had watched me, studied me, learned my routines and my vulnerabilities. I thought about all the times I had gone into town for groceries, all the conversations I had at the feed store or the gas station, mentioning that I lived alone now, that Glenn was gone, that the property was too big for one person, but I could not bring myself to sell. I had told strangers my entire situation without ever thinking twice. The voice outside spoke again, this time directed at me. "Mrs. Hartley, we know you are alone. We know the nearest deputy is 47 minutes away on a good night, and the roads are icy. We know your cell phone does not work out here. We have done this before, and it always goes easier when people cooperate." The casual way he listed these facts, like he was reading from a checklist, made me realize how carefully they had planned everything. They had probably watched the house for weeks, maybe months, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, which lights I turned on and when I turned them off. I backed away from the door, the shotgun still raised, my mind racing through options that all seemed hopeless. The windows were old single-pane glass, easy to break. The doors were solid, but the frames were weak. Even if I shot one of them, there were others, and they would be through the house before I could reload. Then I remembered something, the root cellar. Glenn had dug it himself the second year we lived here, an underground space beneath the kitchen accessible through a trap door hidden under the rug by the pantry. He had installed a heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs, paranoid about tornadoes even though they were rare this far north. The cellar had supplies, canned food, water, a battery-powered radio, and most importantly, it had a lock that could only be opened from the inside. If I could get down there with the dogs, I could wait them out. Eventually, someone would notice I was missing. Eventually, help would come. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan I had, and I was running out of time. I moved quickly, pulling back the rug with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready with the other. The trapdoor was right where it had always been, the iron ring handle cold against my palm. I yanked it open and whistled for the dogs, and Duke understood immediately, bounding down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Copper hesitated, confused, and I had to grab him by the collar and practically shove him through the opening. I was halfway down the stairs myself when I heard glass shatter somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps and voices calling out to each other. They were inside. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, fumbling in the darkness for the steel door at the bottom of the stairs. My fingers found the handle, and I pulled it closed just as I heard footsteps in the kitchen directly above me. The lock was a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would find on a commercial door, and it slid into place with a solid thunk that echoed in the small concrete room. I pressed my back against the cold wall, both dogs huddled against my legs, and I listened to the sounds of my home being torn apart above me. Cabinets slamming, furniture being overturned, and then footsteps directly over the trapdoor, followed by the sound of someone pulling at the handle. A voice, the same calm voice from before, called down through the floor. "Mrs. Hartley, that is a very old door. We have tools, we have time. The choice is yours." I did not answer. I sat in the darkness with my shotgun aimed at the steel door. My dogs pressed against me, and I waited. I heard drilling, prying, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I heard voices arguing, urgent now, the calm tone gone. A vehicle engine started somewhere outside, then another. Through the concrete walls, I heard tires on gravel moving fast, moving away. I did not move from that cellar until sunlight began to creep through the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. When I finally climbed out, my house was destroyed. Every drawer emptied, every closet ransacked, furniture overturned and broken. But I was alive. The sheriff found me sitting on my front porch with the shotgun across my lap, and I told him everything. He listened with the expression I could not read, then told me there had been 3 other home invasions in the county over the past 2 years, all isolated properties, all women living alone. 2 of those women were never seen again. They never caught the men who did it. I sold the property 6 weeks later and moved to Bozeman, where I can see my neighbors' houses from my kitchen window. I still do not sleep through the night. I still wake up at 2:47 in the morning, listening for dogs barking in the distance, waiting for headlights to sweep across a field that no longer exists outside my window. Ridgefield, Montana is the kind of place that does not show up on most maps. Population 200 and something, depending on who had moved away or passed on that year. My best friend Haley and I were sent there every summer to stay with my grandparents while our parents worked. And by the time we finished 6th grade, we knew that dirt road to Perkins General Store better than we knew our own backyards. 4 miles of packed earth cutting through wheat fields and abandoned farmland, with nothing but fence posts and the occasional rusted tractor to break up the endless gold horizon. We had walked it dozens of times without incident, 2 12-year-old girls with too much energy and not enough supervision, picking wild blackberries and racing each other to the old Jennings barn that sat rotting at the halfway point. Our grandparents never worried about us making that trip alone, because nothing ever happened in Ridgefield. That was the whole point of the place, the safety of isolation, the comfort of knowing every single face in town. On that Thursday morning in early June, Grandma pressed a $20 bill into my palm and handed me her grocery list, and Haley and I set off like we had 100 times before. The heat hit us the moment we stepped off the porch, that dry Montana summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the road like a mirage. Haley complained about the dust getting into her sandals, and I told her she should have worn sneakers like I did, and we bickered about nothing as we walked. We were roughly 2 miles in when I heard the engine approaching from behind, which meant nothing at first because farmers drove that road constantly. But this vehicle slowed down in a way that made me turn around and look. A dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper and mud splattered across the wheel wells pulled up alongside us, keeping pace with our walking speed. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window, and I got my first clear look at his face. He had thin blonde hair slicked back against his scalp with something greasy, pale blue eyes that seemed too wide for his face, and a smile that stretched his lips in a way that showed every single one of his yellow teeth. When he spoke, his voice came out warm and friendly, the kind of voice adults use when they want children to trust them immediately. "You girls must be the Whitaker grandkids," he said, nodding like he already knew the answer. "Heading to Perkins, I bet. Your grandma send you for groceries?" I remember feeling a small wave of relief at that moment, because he knew our family name, which meant he had to be a local, someone safe. Haley relaxed a little beside me too, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The man kept talking, explaining that he worked on one of the farms further out past the county line and came through Ridgefield every few weeks for supplies. He said his name was Gene, or maybe it was Dean, something short and plain that I cannot remember clearly anymore because everything that came after erased those small details from my mind. What I do remember is what he said next, leaning further toward the open window with that strange wide smile still plastered across his face. He told us there had been coyote attacks on the road up ahead, that a pack had gotten bold and gone after a couple of dogs just yesterday, and it was not safe for 2 young girls to be walking alone. Haley looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether to believe him. The thing was, coyote problems were not unusual in that area, and we had been warned about them before by our grandfather, who kept a rifle by the back door for that exact reason. So the story made sense, and the man seemed to know that it would. He offered us a ride the rest of the way to the store, saying it would only take a few minutes, and he was heading that direction anyway. I hesitated, feeling something heavy settle in my chest that I could not explain, a reluctance that had no logical source. But Haley was already moving toward the truck, and I did not want to seem like a scared little kid in front of her. I climbed into the cab after her, settling onto the cracked leather bench seat that smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and faintly chemical that I could not identify. The man pulled back onto the road, and for a minute everything seemed normal. Just the rumble of the engine and the dust billowing behind us through the rear window. Then I noticed we were not going the right way. The road to Perkins continued straight for another 2 miles before curving slightly east toward the village center. But this man had turned left onto a narrow side path that led into the overgrown Jennings property. I knew that land well because Haley and I had explored the edges of it many times, daring each other to get closer to the collapsing barn with its dark windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as the main road disappeared behind a wall of tall wild grass, and my heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said this was a shortcut that would get us to the store faster. But that was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because this road led nowhere except deeper into abandoned farmland. Haley grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, her palm slick with sweat. I looked at her face and saw my own fear reflected back at me, her eyes wide and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The man kept talking in that same cheerful tone, telling us about the weather and the wheat harvest and other things that meant nothing, filling the air with words so we would not have time to think. But I was thinking, and what I was thinking was that nobody knew where we were. Our grandparents expected us to be gone for at least 2 hours, and if we disappeared into these fields, no one would even start looking for us until lunchtime. The truck slowed down as we approached the old Jennings barn, and I saw that someone had been here recently because there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and the padlock on the barn door had been replaced with a shiny new one. The man pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine, and in that sudden silence I could hear birds singing somewhere far away and the tick of the cooling motor. He turned to look at us with that same terrible smile, and he said we should wait here for just a minute while he checked on something inside the barn. That was when Haley screamed. It was not a word or a call for help, just a raw animal sound of pure terror that seemed to unlock something in both of us. She yanked the door handle and threw herself out of the truck before I even understood what was happening, and I followed her a half-second later, my feet hitting the ground hard enough to send a jolt of pain up through my ankles. The man shouted something behind us, his friendly voice gone sharp and ugly, but I did not turn around to see if he was chasing us. We ran into the tall grass, pushing through stalks that whipped against our faces and arms, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Haley somewhere to my left, crashing through the vegetation, and I angled toward the sound of her footsteps. The grass was so high that I could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and I kept expecting to feel a hand close around my arm or my hair at any moment. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I did not slow down, could not slow down, because somewhere behind us was a man who had taken us to an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and I knew with absolute certainty what that meant. We ran until the grass thinned out and gave way to a plowed field, the dirt soft and uneven beneath our feet. I stumbled twice and caught myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw against rocks and dry clods of earth. Haley was crying now, loud hiccuping sobs that she could not control, and I grabbed her wrist and pulled her along because we could not stop yet. In the distance, I could see a farmhouse with a red roof and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, and I pointed toward it and told Haley to keep going. My whole body was shaking, not just my hands but my legs and my jaw and something deep inside my chest that would not stop trembling no matter how hard I tried to control it. We crossed what felt like miles of open field, exposed and vulnerable under that bright blue sky, before we finally reached the farmhouse and I started pounding on the door with both fists. A woman in her 60s opened it, flour on her apron and confusion on her face, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and desperate, and I could see that she did not understand. Her name was Loretta Grimes, and she sat us down at her kitchen table and gave us glasses of water while she called our grandparents. Haley could not stop crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, and I held her hand across the table while I tried to answer Loretta's questions. I told her about the man in the green truck, about the lie he told us about coyotes, about the turn onto the side road and the barn with the new padlock. Loretta's face went pale as I spoke, and she picked up the phone again to call the sheriff's office in the next town over. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of fear and fury that I had never seen before, and he wrapped both of us in his arms so tight I could barely breathe. The sheriff's deputy showed up an hour after that, a young man with a notepad who wrote down everything I said and nodded seriously but did not seem particularly alarmed. He told us the description matched several trucks in the county and that without a license plate number, there was not much they could do. My grandmother kept saying we should never have been walking alone, that it was her fault for sending us, and the guilt in her voice made me feel worse than anything else that had happened that day. The following weeks were strange and uncomfortable in ways I did not expect. Word spread through Ridgefield quickly, as it does in small towns, but the reaction was not what I thought it would be. Some people believed us completely and praised us for being smart enough to run, but others, including people I had known my whole life, suggested that we had misunderstood the situation. Maybe the man really was just trying to help, they said. Maybe we panicked for no reason and made a nice farmer look like a criminal. One older man at the general store told my grandfather that city kids were always too suspicious, too dramatic, and that we probably scared a good Samaritan half to death by jumping out of his truck like that. The doubt hurt almost as much as the memory of that day, and Haley and I stopped talking about what happened because it seemed like nobody wanted to hear it. We finished out the summer at our grandparents' house, but we never walked to the store alone again. And we never explored the old Jennings property, and we slept in the same bed every night because neither of us could stand to be alone in the dark. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, my mother called with news that made her voice crack and tremble through the phone line. A man had been arrested in Carroll County, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield, after attempting to force a 9-year-old boy into his vehicle outside a gas station. The boy's father had been inside paying and came out just in time to see what was happening, and he held the man down until police arrived. The vehicle was a dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper. When investigators searched the property where the man lived, a rented trailer on the edge of an old farming community, they found things that my mother would not describe to me no matter how many times I asked. She only said that the man had done this before, in other counties, in other states, and that some of those children had never been found. I sat on the edge of my bed in my childhood room, the phone pressed against my ear, and I thought about that barn with the shiny new padlock and the fresh tire tracks in the mud. I thought about how close we had come to being part of a story that ended very differently. A story that might have ended with our photographs on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across Montana. Haley and I are adults now, both of us with families of our own, and we have only talked about that day a handful of times in all the years since. But I think about it more often than I would like to admit, usually when I see my own daughter walking home from school or riding her bike around the neighborhood. I taught her early about strangers and cars and the lies that dangerous people tell, and I made sure she understood that politeness is never more important than survival. She knows that if something feels wrong, she should run first and explain later, and she knows that I will always believe her no matter what anyone else says. The man who drove that green truck is serving multiple life sentences now, locked away in a place where he cannot hurt anyone else. But sometimes late at night when sleep will not come, I still see his face through that rolled down window. I still see those yellowed teeth stretched into that wide, unnatural smile. And I still hear his friendly voice, asking if we were the Whitaker grandkids heading to the store. And I wonder how many other children heard that same voice, saw that same smile, and were not lucky enough or fast enough to escape into the tall grass before it was too late. My cousin got me the job at the grain facility out near Harlow County, about 40 minutes from the nearest town with a stoplight. He worked for the agricultural company that owned the place and said they needed someone to cover night shifts for a few weeks, while their regular guy recovered from back surgery. Simple work, he promised. Walk the perimeter twice a night, log any delivery trucks that came through, check the temperature gauges on the storage bays, and make sure nobody was messing around on the property. The pay was decent for what amounted to sitting in a small office trailer and reading most of the night. I had just finished my teaching certification and was waiting for the school district to finalize my contract for the fall semester, so the timing worked out. My girlfriend thought I was crazy for taking a job in the middle of nowhere, but we needed the money, and 6 weeks of overnight shifts seemed like easy cash. The facility itself sat on about 15 acres of flat land surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides and a county road on the 4th. There were 6 massive grain silos, a long metal warehouse for equipment storage, and 3 smaller storage bays used for overflow during harvest season. The office trailer where I spent most of my time was positioned near the front gate, close enough to the road that I could see headlights coming from a mile away. My first 3 shifts were exactly what my cousin described, boring in the best way possible. I did my rounds at midnight and again at 4 in the morning, wrote down a whole lot of nothing in the logbook, and spent the rest of my time grading practice tests I had created for the class I would be teaching in September. The only company I had was the security cameras, 8 of them total, feeding grainy black and white footage to a monitor that looked like it belonged in the 90s. The night sounds out there took some getting used to. The grain settling in the silos made these deep groaning noises, and the wind coming across the fields would rattle the metal siding on the warehouse something fierce. It was my 4th shift when I noticed the first thing that seemed wrong. During my midnight round, I walked past Storage Bay 2, one of the smaller units used for equipment and spare parts, and saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading up to the roll-up door. Now that door was supposed to stay locked, and according to the schedule my cousin had given me, no deliveries were expected until the following Tuesday. I checked the lock and it was secure, so I figured maybe someone from the day crew had pulled up there earlier and I just had not noticed the tracks before. I wrote it down in the logbook anyway, the way I was supposed to, and finished my round without thinking much more about it. But when I came back around at 4 in the morning, I noticed something else. There was a dark stain on the concrete pad right outside the bay door, maybe 2 feet wide, like someone had spilled something and tried to wash it away. The edges were still wet. I crouched down and touched it, and my fingers came up with this faint pinkish color. Looked diluted, like whatever it was had been hosed down but not completely cleaned. I stood there for a while trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe one of the day workers had cut himself and cleaned it up. Maybe someone hit a deer on the road and pulled in to check their vehicle. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but something kept nagging at me. Why would anyone wash down a spill at a grain facility in the middle of the night? I took a few pictures with my phone, just in case, and went back to the trailer. I thought about calling my cousin, but it was almost 5 in the morning and I did not want to wake him up over what was probably nothing. The rest of that shift, I kept looking at those pictures, zooming in like I was going to find some answer hidden in the pixels. When the day supervisor showed up at 6 to relieve me, I mentioned the tire tracks and the stain. He was this older guy named Dwight, been working there for 15 years, and he just shrugged and said it was probably hydraulic fluid from one of the tractors. He did not seem concerned at all, so I let it go, but I saved those pictures anyway. 2 nights later, I found the tools. I was doing my 4 in the morning round, walking along the back side of the warehouse where the security cameras did not reach. There was a dead zone back there, maybe 60 feet of space between the building and the fence line that nobody had bothered to cover. I almost tripped over a canvas bag sitting in the weeds near the drainage ditch. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a set of bolt cutters, a crowbar, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. None of it belonged to the facility. I knew every piece of equipment in that warehouse because I had walked through it during my orientation, and this stuff was not on any inventory list. The bolt cutters still had price tags on them from a hardware store I did not recognize. I stood there holding that bag, my heart going a mile a minute, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some random stuff that blew in or got dumped by kids messing around. But bolt cutters and duct tape do not just appear together by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it, marked the spot in my head, and walked back to the trailer as fast as I could without running. I called my cousin that morning after my shift ended. Told him everything, the tire tracks, the stain, the bag of tools. He got quiet for a long time, which was not like him at all. Finally, he said I should keep my head down and not mention any of this to Dwight or anyone else at the facility. He said he would make some calls and figure out what was going on, but in the meantime, I should just do my job and stay in the trailer as much as possible. That advice did not sit right with me. I asked him what he thought was happening, and he just said some of the storage bays got leased out to third parties, and he did not always know what they were being used for. The way he said it made me feel like he knew more than he was telling me. I barely slept that day. I lay in bed at my apartment staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Drug storage maybe, stolen merchandise. I even thought about human trafficking, but that seemed too extreme. Too much like something from a documentary. By the time I drove back out to the facility that evening for my next shift, I had almost talked myself into quitting. But I needed that money, and I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting to a bunch of coincidences. That night changed everything. I got to the facility around 9, same as always, and Dwight handed off the keys without much conversation. He seemed tired, distracted, and he left quicker than usual. I settled into the trailer, made some coffee, and started going through my lesson plans. Around 11, I noticed headlights on the security monitor, a truck coming down the access road from the back of the property, not from the main county road where deliveries usually came. That road was supposed to be gated and locked, only used during harvest season when they needed extra access for the big equipment. I watched the truck pull around behind Storage Bay 2, the same bay where I had found the tire tracks. It sat there for about 10 minutes with its lights off, and then it left the same way it came. No one got out that I could see. No one approached the trailer or checked in with me. According to every protocol I had been given, any vehicle on the property at night was supposed to log in with the night watchman. That was literally my entire job. I wrote down the time and a description of the truck: white full-size pickup, no visible plates from the camera angle, and I sat there wondering if I should go check the bay or just pretend I had not seen anything. I waited about an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk out there. The night was warm and still, no wind for once, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I took my flashlight and walked the long way around, staying close to the silos where I could duck out of sight if I needed to. When I got to Storage Bay 2, I noticed the padlock was different. The old one had been brass, weathered and scratched up from years of use. This one was silver, brand new, with a black rubber coating around the shackle. Someone had changed the lock. I put my ear against the roll-up door. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a movie, but I did not know what else to do. And I heard nothing at first. Just the metal ticking as it cooled down from the day's heat. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. Voices. Muffled, impossible to make out the words, but definitely human voices coming from inside the bay. And then a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately like someone had been hurt, and then silenced. I backed away from that door so fast I almost fell over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to convince myself it was something else. An animal, a radio, anything but what it sounded like. I made it back to the trailer in what felt like seconds, locked the door behind me, and sat there staring at the security monitors with my phone in my hand. I should have called the police right then. I know that now. But I kept thinking about what my cousin had said, about keeping my head down, about how some of the bays were leased to third parties. What if I was wrong? What if I called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? And I lost my job and my cousin lost his job, and I looked like a paranoid idiot. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, arguing with myself. And then I saw movement on the monitor. Someone was walking toward the trailer. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, coming from the direction of Storage Bay 2. He was not rushing, not trying to hide. He walked like someone who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be on that property in the middle of the night. I watched him get closer and closer until he walked right out of the camera's frame, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the trailer door. He knocked 3 times, slow and deliberate. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Through the small window next to the door, I could see the outline of his shape, just standing there, waiting. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost friendly. He said he knew I was in there and that we needed to have a conversation about what I had seen over the past few nights. He said it in a way that made it clear he already knew everything. The pictures I took, the bag of tools I found, the fact that I had been asking questions. He said I seemed like a smart guy, and smart guys understood when it was better to look the other way. He said some people made good money just by not seeing things, and that could be me if I wanted it to be. He never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and I did not say a single word. After what felt like forever, he knocked once more, just once, and then the footsteps moved away. I watched on the monitor as he walked back toward the storage bay, got into a dark SUV I had not noticed before, and drove off using that back access road. I did not finish that shift. The second his taillights disappeared from the camera, I grabbed my keys and walked straight to my car. I did not clock out, did not leave a note, did not call anyone. I just drove. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes back to town. I called my cousin the next morning and told him I was done, that I was not going back to that facility ever again. He did not argue. He did not ask questions, he just said he understood, and that he would take care of it with the company. A week later, I saw on the local news that there had been a fire at an agricultural storage facility in Harlow County. Electrical malfunction, they said. Storage Bay 2 was completely destroyed. No injuries reported, no investigation opened. The facility shut down for repairs and never reopened. My cousin stopped returning my calls after that. We have not spoken in almost 2 years now, and when I see him at family gatherings, he acts like nothing ever happened. Like those 6 weeks just got erased from both our memories. I never found out what was really going on in that storage bay. I never found out who that man was or what happened to whoever made that sound I heard through the door. Some nights I still think about it. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through everything I should have done differently. I should have called the police that first night when I found the stain. I should have trusted my gut instead of listening to my cousin. I should have done something instead of just running away, but I did not, and now I have to live with that. The teaching job came through a few weeks after everything happened, and I threw myself into work, tried to move on, tried to convince myself that whatever was happening at that facility was not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I will be driving at night and I will pass some industrial building sitting alone in the dark, lights off, nothing moving, and I will feel this cold twist in my chest. Because I know now that there are places like that everywhere. Places where things happen that nobody talks about, and there are people whose job it is to make sure nobody ever finds out. I was almost one of those people. Sometimes I wonder if the only reason I am still here, still able to tell this story, is because I was smart enough to stay quiet and scared enough to run. And I do not know which part of that bothers me more. Rural Kansas has a way of making you feel both free and completely exposed at the same time. When my dad passed in 2017, he left me 47 acres of farmland that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it dirt cheap during the Depression. My wife Sheila and I had been renting a cramped apartment in Denver for 6 years by then, and with our twin daughters about to start kindergarten, the timing felt right. We moved in that September, right around my high school reunion, which made me realize how much time had slipped by since I left that small town as a kid, dreaming of city life. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, almost a mile from the county route, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and a few scattered oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The previous tenant, a guy named Jerry Mullins who helped my dad maintain the place after his stroke, had moved out 3 months before we arrived. The house needed work, but it was ours, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe. The trouble started in late October, maybe 6 weeks after we settled in. We had been dealing with the usual rural annoyances: hunters cutting across the back acres without permission, teenagers using the empty barn for weekend parties, that kind of thing. Sheila found beer cans and cigarette butts near the old grain silo one morning, and that was the final straw for her. She wanted a gate, something solid with a good lock, to keep people from just driving onto our land whenever they felt like it. I agreed, mostly to ease her mind, and spent a whole Saturday installing a heavy steel gate at the entrance where our dirt road met the county route. I bought a thick padlock from the hardware store in town, one of those hardened steel ones that cost almost $40. We each kept a key, and I hid a spare inside the hollow fence post nearby, just in case. That first night with the gate locked, I remember Sheila squeezing my hand at dinner and saying she finally felt safe out here. I believed her when she said it, and I believed it myself. 3 days later, I woke up around 5 in the morning to let the dog out and noticed the gate was wide open, not broken, not forced, just open, swinging gently in the November wind like someone had casually unlocked it and forgotten to close it behind them. I walked the whole length of that dirt road in my bathrobe and boots, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of what happened. Nothing. No trash, no footprints that I could make out in the dark, no indication that anyone had even been there. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly, even though I could picture myself clicking that padlock shut and tugging it twice to make sure. Sheila gave me a look when I came back inside, the kind of look that said she was trusting me to keep us safe out here. I promised her it would not happen again, and I meant it. That evening, I checked the lock 3 separate times before coming inside for dinner, but it did happen again. The following Monday morning, Sheila was the one who found it, gate wide open, padlock hanging loose on the chain like it had been gently placed there by someone with all the time in the world. This time I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle that had driven right up our road sometime during the night. I followed those tracks almost halfway to the house before they curved off toward the old barn and disappeared into the harder ground near the equipment shed. I searched that barn top to bottom, checked every stall, climbed up into the hayloft where dust hung thick in the morning light. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had definitely been on our property. Someone with a key. I called the sheriff that afternoon, and Deputy Nolan came out to take a report, but he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. "Probably just kids," he said. "Probably someone messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but those tire tracks told a different story. I replaced the lock that same week, drove 30 miles to a different hardware store because I did not want to buy from the same place, thinking maybe somehow someone had gotten a duplicate made. This new padlock was even heavier, a different brand with keys that had a unique pattern cut into them. I threw away the old lock entirely and made sure only Sheila and I had copies this time. No spare hidden in the fence post, nothing. For about 10 days, everything seemed normal. The gate stayed locked, the road stayed empty, and I started to convince myself that Deputy Nolan had been right after all. Maybe it really was just some kids playing a prank, and once they realized we were serious about security, they moved on to easier targets. Sheila stopped checking the windows every night before bed. The girls started playing outside again without one of us hovering nearby. I let my guard down, and that was exactly when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning in mid-November when I walked out to check the gate and found something that made me stop dead in the middle of the road. The gate was locked, completely secure, chain wrapped tight, padlock clicked shut just like I had left it. But it was not my padlock. The one hanging there was silver instead of black, a completely different brand, with a keyhole that my keys would never fit. Someone had come onto our property during the night, removed my lock entirely, and replaced it with their own. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not a prank. This was not teenagers looking for a place to drink beer. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know they could come and go whenever they pleased, that no lock I bought would keep them out. They were sending a message, and the message was clear. This property belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. I cut that lock off with bolt cutters and bought a third one that afternoon, but my hands were unsteady the whole drive home. Sheila wanted to move. She said it plainly over dinner that night, the girls already in bed, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. She said she did not feel safe anymore, that whoever was doing this knew too much about our routines, about when we were asleep, about how to get in without leaving a trace. I tried to calm her down, told her we would figure it out. But the truth was I did not have answers. I called Deputy Nolan again the next morning, and he came out to look at the new lock I had cut off, turning it over in his hands like it was a curiosity rather than evidence. He said there was not much he could do without catching someone in the act. No crime had technically been committed, no theft, no property damage beyond the locks themselves. He suggested we install cameras, maybe motion lights, something to discourage whoever was doing this. It felt like being told to solve my own problem, but I did not know what else to do. That night I ordered 2 trail cameras online, the kind hunters use to photograph deer, and paid extra for overnight shipping. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, and I spent most of that afternoon mounting them. One pointed directly at the gate, hidden inside a wooden birdhouse I nailed to a tree about 20 feet back. and another aimed at the dirt road from the corner of our front porch. They were motion activated, designed to capture clear images even in total darkness using infrared. I tested them a dozen times, walking back and forth in front of each one until I was satisfied they were working perfectly. Sheila watched me from the kitchen window the whole time, and when I came inside, she hugged me longer than usual. We both knew that whatever those cameras captured might change everything. That night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if the motion alerts had triggered. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, quiet, still. The gate locked tight every morning when I walked out to check. By Friday, I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves had scared whoever it was away. If just knowing they were being watched was enough to make them stop. I should have known better than to hope for something that simple. Saturday morning, I woke up to 3 motion alerts on my phone, all time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mouth went dry before I even opened the app. The first image showed headlights approaching the gate from the county route, just 2 bright circles floating in the darkness. The second image was clearer. A pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe blue or green, parked right in front of the gate with its engine still running. I could see exhaust rising in the cold air, caught by the infrared flash. The third image is the one that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stay there for a long time. A man stood at the gate, his back to the camera, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was not cutting the lock. He was not forcing anything. He had a key in his hand, and he was unlocking my gate the same way I did every single day, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. The camera caught him mid-motion, his arm extended, the lock already open in his other hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. I showed Sheila the photos and watched her face go pale. She asked me if I recognized the truck, and I told her I did not. But something about it nagged at me. The shape of it, the way the tailgate sat slightly crooked like it had been bent in an accident years ago. I spent the next hour going through every image the cameras had captured, frame by frame, looking for anything that might help identify this person. The camera near the house had triggered too, showing the same truck driving slowly up our road, headlights off now, moving like a shadow through the darkness toward the barn. There were 6 images total of the vehicle parked behind the equipment shed, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before it turned around and left the same way it came. 40 minutes. This person had been on our property for 40 minutes while my wife and daughters slept in their beds, while I lay dreaming not 200 yards away. I called Deputy Nolan again, and this time he actually sounded interested. He asked me to email him the photos, said he would run the truck through some databases, see if anything came up. But I was done waiting for the sheriff to solve this. I needed to find out who this was myself. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the diner where most of the old-timers gathered for breakfast. I figured if anyone knew about a dark pickup truck with a crooked tailgate, it would be someone who had lived in this county their whole life. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, then started asking questions as casually as I could. Mentioned I was looking for someone who might do some work on my property, someone who knew the area well. A woman named Betty who worked the register overheard me and asked which property I was talking about. When I told her, she got quiet for a second before saying I should talk to Jerry Mullins. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Jerry Mullins, the same man who had worked for my father, who had lived on our property as a caretaker for almost 3 years before we moved in. Betty said Jerry had a dark green Ford pickup, older model, with a dented tailgate from when he backed into a fence post years ago. She said he still lived about 15 miles north, in a trailer near the creek, and that he had been having money troubles ever since my father let him go. I did not correct her. My father never let Jerry go. Jerry had simply stopped showing up after my dad got too sick to manage the property anymore. I thanked Betty, left a $10 bill on the counter, and drove straight to the address she gave me. I found Jerry Mullins sitting on a plastic chair outside his trailer, smoking a cigarette and watching the road like he had been expecting someone. The truck was parked right there beside him. Dark green, crooked tailgate, the same vehicle from my camera footage. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not even stand up when I got out of my car and walked toward him. I asked him straight out if he had been coming onto my property at night, and he just took a long drag of his cigarette before nodding slowly, like I had asked him about the weather. He said he still had keys. He said my father had given him copies years ago, back when he was trusted to come and go as he pleased, and he had never seen a reason to give them back. When I asked him why, what he was doing out there in the middle of the night, he looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. I still cannot tell which. He said he had been storing things in the barn. Equipment, tools, some furniture he could not fit in his trailer. He said he figured no one was using the space anyway, and he did not think it would matter. 3 years of my father being sick, then dead, and Jerry had just kept coming and going like the property was still his responsibility. Like nothing had changed at all. I wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to grab him by his jacket and demand to know what gave him the right. What made him think he could terrorize my family like that? Make my wife afraid to sleep in her own home. But looking at him sitting there in that plastic chair, his clothes worn thin, his trailer rusting at the edges, I mostly just felt tired. I told him to give me the keys, all of them, every copy he had ever made. He went inside without a word and came back with a small metal ring holding 4 different keys, each one labeled with faded tape that had my father's handwriting on it. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He handed them over and I stood there holding them, feeling the weight of all those years my father had trusted this man. I asked Jerry if he understood that he could not come back, that this was over now. He nodded and stubbed out his cigarette on the arm of his chair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to scare anyone, that he always came late at night specifically so he would not bother us. Like that made it better. Like the intent behind the fear somehow erased the fear itself. I drove home and told Sheila everything. We searched the barn together that afternoon and found exactly what Jerry had described. Boxes of old tools, a broken generator, some water-damaged furniture stacked in the corner of the hayloft. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just the sad remnants of a man who could not let go of a place that was no longer his. I changed every lock on the property that weekend, installed new deadbolts, and added 2 more cameras just to be safe. Deputy Nolan closed the case without filing charges after I told him I did not want to press the issue. Jerry was pathetic more than criminal, and dragging him through the courts would not undo the weeks of fear we had already lived through. Sheila still checks the gate every morning before I wake up. Sometimes I catch her standing at the window late at night, watching the road, waiting for headlights that I pray will never come again. We talk about selling the place sometimes, starting over somewhere else, but this land belonged to my family for almost a century, and I'm not ready to let one troubled man take that from us. The locks are changed, the cameras are watching, and Jerry Mullins has not come back. But I still keep those 4 keys he gave me, tucked in a drawer beside my bed, where I can look at them whenever I need to remind myself that the thing I feared most was not a monster or a ghost. It was just a man with a key and nowhere else to go. Buying a house on 12 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia was supposed to be the best decision of my life. I had spent my 20s bouncing between cramped apartments in Richmond, sharing walls with people who screamed at each other at all hours, and when my grandmother passed and left me enough for a down payment, I did not hesitate. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1940s according to the county records, with a sagging porch, outdated kitchen cabinets, and a well pump that groaned every morning like it was in pain. But it sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and for the first time in my adult life, I could not hear a single neighbor. I worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, typing up doctor notes in my pajamas, so the isolation suited me perfectly. My closest neighbor was Harold Jennings, an 80-something widower who lived about a mile down the road. We had a deal where I checked on him twice a week and he kept an eye on my property when I was away. By June, I had been living there for 8 months, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. That Saturday started like any other weekend. I woke up around 9, made coffee, and spent most of the day at my desk finishing a backlog of transcription files. For dinner, I made spaghetti and watched a couple episodes of a true crime show on Netflix. Ironic, considering what happened later. Around 11, I took my dog Pepper outside for her last bathroom break of the night. She was a 6-year-old shelter mutt, brown and white patches with one floppy ear that never quite stood upright. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for early June in Virginia, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin. I stood on the porch watching Pepper sniff around the yard, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky, in a way you never see in the city. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Pepper finished her business, trotted back inside, and I locked the front door behind us. Checked the back door out of habit. Went to bed around midnight feeling completely safe. I do not know how long I had been asleep when Pepper started growling. It was not her normal growl, the one she did when she saw a squirrel through the window or heard a car drive by on the main road. This was low and sustained, coming from deep in her chest, and she was standing at my bedroom door facing the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had set her off. Then I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive. Just 3 steady knocks like someone was being polite about it. My first thought was that something had happened to Harold. Maybe he had fallen. Maybe he had walked over in some kind of confused state. He was getting up there in age, and I worried about him. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, Pepper staying right at my heels, still growling that low rumble. The front door had a small window at the top, but it was dark outside and I could not see much. I also had a window to the left of the door that looked out onto the porch, covered by thin curtains. I did not turn on any lights. Something told me not to, some instinct I cannot really explain. So I just stood there in the dark, trying to see through the curtain. Then came another knock, and a voice, a man's voice, calm and friendly. He said his car had broken down about half a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if he could use my phone to call someone for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on these back roads where cell service was spotty at best. But it was almost 2 in the morning, and I was a woman alone, and something about the situation made every muscle in my body tighten. I moved closer to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch to get a better look at who was standing on my porch. He looked normal. That was the thing that made it so hard to know what to do. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain dark t-shirt, average build, short brown hair. He had his hands in his pockets and he was standing a few feet back from the door, not pressed up against it like someone desperate or aggressive would be. He looked like a regular guy who had car trouble. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting all those crime documentaries get to my head. But Pepper was still growling, her hackles raised all the way down her spine, and that dog had never been wrong about people. I had seen her wag her tail at complete strangers, and I had seen her bark at men who later turned out to be bad news. She had instincts I had learned to trust. So instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. I told him I could call someone for him, asked what number he needed. He said he appreciated that, gave me a name, said his brother lived about 20 miles away and could come pick him up. He even gave me a phone number. It all sounded so normal, so reasonable. I had my phone in my hand, ready to dial, when I glanced out the side window again. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a half moon. But my eyes had adjusted to the darkness by then. The man was still standing there, patient, waiting. And that is when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was a deer, we had plenty of those around. But the shape was wrong. It was upright. It was a person, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, heading toward the back of my house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked back at the man on the porch, and he was still standing there with that same calm expression, like he had all the time in the world. He had no idea I had seen the other one. Or maybe he knew exactly what was happening and this whole thing was part of a plan. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying to think. My mind was racing through options. I could call 911, but the nearest sheriff's station was at least 25 minutes away, and I had no idea how much time I had. I could call Harold, but what was an 80-year-old man going to do? I thought about the back door, wondered if it was really locked, wondered if that second person was already testing it. The man on the porch knocked again, a little louder this time, and asked if everything was okay. His voice was still friendly, but there was something underneath it now, a hint of impatience. I told him through the door that I was calling his brother right now, that help would be on the way soon. I was stalling, buying myself time to figure out what to do. I moved quickly and quietly through the dark house to the kitchen, where I could see the backyard through the window above the sink. The second figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the house, and I could see it was a man, bigger than the one on the porch, wearing dark clothes and some kind of cap. He was not even trying to hide anymore. He was just walking toward my back door like he belonged there. I grabbed the biggest knife from the block on the counter. It was not much, but it was something. Then I went back to the front of the house and told the man on the porch that I was not going to open the door. I said I had called 911 and the police were on their way. It was a lie. I had not called yet, but I needed him to believe it. There was a long pause. I could not see his face from where I was standing, but I could feel the shift in the air, like the whole situation had changed in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The friendliness was gone. He said something like, "Come on, I just need to use your phone. Why are you making this difficult?" But it was not a question. It was a statement. And then I heard the back door handle rattle. Not a knock, not a polite request. Someone was trying to open it, testing to see if it was locked. Pepper went absolutely crazy, barking and snarling and throwing herself toward the back of the house. The man on the porch started pounding on the front door now. Not knocking anymore, pounding, and he was saying something, but I could not hear it over Pepper and the blood rushing in my ears. I finally called 911. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking fast, too fast, trying to explain that two men were trying to break into my house, that I was alone, that I needed help right now. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me to stay on the line, that she was sending units my way. But I knew how far away they were. I knew I was on my own for at least 20 minutes, probably more. The pounding on the front door stopped suddenly, and that silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood in the hallway between the front and back of the house, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Pepper pressed against my leg, still growling. I could hear footsteps on the porch, then nothing. Then I heard glass break somewhere at the back of the house. Not the door, one of the windows. The one in the small laundry room that I always meant to put a better lock on but never did. Pepper bolted toward the sound, barking so loud it hurt my ears, and I heard a man curse, and then more glass breaking as he tried to clear the frame. I ran to the laundry room doorway and saw a dark shape halfway through the window, one leg already inside. I did not think. I just reacted. I screamed at him, something I do not even remember, and I swung that knife at his arm. I felt it connect, felt resistance, and he yelled and pulled back out the window so fast he cut himself more on the broken glass. There was blood on my kitchen knife and blood on the window frame, and I was shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what was happening, and I was trying to tell her, but the words were not coming out right. I backed away from the window, expecting him to come through again or expecting the other one to try the front, but for a moment, everything went quiet. Pepper was still barking, but it was different now, more frantic, like she was trying to track movements she could hear, but I could not. I kept switching my attention between the front door and the broken window, waiting for someone to come through, knowing I could not defend both at the same time. Then I heard a car engine start. It was faint at first, somewhere down my gravel driveway, and then it got louder and I heard tires spinning on loose rock. I ran to the front window and saw taillights disappearing down the road, moving fast with no headlights on. They were leaving. I did not understand it at first. I was still braced for someone to come crashing through a door or window. But the sounds outside faded, and then there was nothing but crickets and Pepper whimpering beside me. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher for another 18 minutes until I saw the red and blue lights coming up my driveway. 2 deputies came to the door and I finally unlocked it, still holding that knife, still shaking. One of them was a woman named Hartley, who took the knife gently from my hand and led me to sit down while her partner cleared the house. They found blood on the laundry room window, on the ground outside, and a trail of it leading into the woods where they must have parked their car somewhere out of sight. The deputies told me I did the right thing, that I was lucky, that most people would have opened that door. The sheriff's department investigated for weeks, but never found them. No matching DNA in the system, no witnesses, no abandoned car with a flat tire anywhere near my road. It was like they had never existed. But here is the part that still keeps me up at night, even 2 years later. About 3 weeks after it happened, a deputy called to tell me they had connected my case to 2 other incidents in the county from the previous year. Same pattern. A man knocking on a door late at night with a story about car trouble. A second person waiting in the shadows. The other 2 houses, the people had opened their doors. One woman was beaten badly and robbed. The other, an older couple, the husband did not survive. They had been targeting isolated homes, places where help was far away, places where people still trusted strangers enough to open their doors at night. I never found out if they were caught. I moved back to Richmond 6 months later. I still have Pepper, and she still growls sometimes at night for no reason I can see. When she does, I do not go back to sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a knock that I hope never comes. "14 years of warehouse work in New Jersey had left me burned out in ways I did not fully understand, until I quit. When my buddy Glenn mentioned a seasonal crop management gig in rural Virginia, I jumped at it without thinking twice. My engagement had collapsed the previous spring. I was renting a depressing studio apartment, and the idea of wide-open spaces sounded like medicine. The contract was simple. 6 months overseeing soybean fields for an agricultural company, with a rent-free farmhouse included as part of the deal. I loaded my Ford pickup and drove 5 hours south on a Wednesday morning in early September 2018. The property sat at the end of a gravel road called Hendricks Mill Lane, about 12 miles from the nearest town with a grocery store. The farmhouse itself was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But the land stretched out flat and golden under the late summer sun, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first week passed without any trouble. I spent my days learning the irrigation system, checking soil moisture levels, and driving the perimeter of the 300 acres I was responsible for. The nearest neighbor, according to my contract paperwork, was a property about half a mile east. But the county records listed it as unoccupied, owned by some agricultural trust based out of Richmond. I could see the outline of a farmhouse and a large barn from my kitchen window, sitting dark against the tree line. No cars in the driveway, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The isolation took some getting used to, especially at night when the silence became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in bed. But I kept busy, called my mom every few days, and started settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. It was on the 8th night, a Tuesday, when I first noticed the lights. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I glanced out the bathroom window and saw a faint yellow glow coming from the supposedly empty property to the east. A single light, maybe in an upstairs window, burning steady through the darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the trust had sent someone to check on the property, or perhaps a caretaker stopped by occasionally. I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, but I kept thinking about that light. The next morning, I drove the perimeter as usual and slowed down when I passed the eastern boundary. From the road, the neighboring farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as before, peeling white paint, overgrown grass pushing up through cracks in the driveway, a rusted mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. No vehicles anywhere. I parked my truck and walked closer to the fence line, trying to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. The place looked like it had been empty for years. I even checked my phone to confirm what I remembered from the county records, and there it was in black and white. Property owned by Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust. Status unoccupied, last recorded activity dated back to 2014. I drove back to my farmhouse feeling stupid for even worrying about it. Old houses have electrical quirks, timers on lights, all kinds of explanations. But then it happened again that same night. This time I was sitting on the back porch around 10, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets, when I saw not one but 3 lights come on in sequence across the neighboring property. First the upstairs window, then something on the ground floor, then a light inside the barn. They stayed on for maybe 20 minutes, then went dark one by one in reverse order. I sat there with my beer getting warm in my hand, watching that dark silhouette against the tree line, waiting for something else to happen. It did not. The property just sat there, black and silent, like it had been abandoned all along. I went inside and locked every door, which felt ridiculous given that I had not locked anything since arriving. That night I slept poorly, waking up twice to sounds I could not identify. A low rumble that might have been a vehicle on a distant road, a rhythmic creaking that was probably just the house settling. In the morning, I found myself checking the windows before I even made coffee, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The following Saturday, I drove into town to pick up supplies and decided to ask around about the neighboring property. The town was called Burkeville, a small cluster of buildings centered around a gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Maxine's that seemed to serve as the local gathering spot. I grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up in a bun. Her name tag said Darlene. When she brought my food, I mentioned I was working the Henderson contract out on Hendricks Mill Lane, and she nodded like she already knew. Small towns are like that. I asked her about the property to the east of mine, the one owned by some agricultural trust, and her expression changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Not fear exactly, more like caution. She said she did not know much about it, that properties changed hands a lot around here, and then she moved down the counter to refill someone else's coffee. I tried asking the guy sitting 2 stools over, a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap who had been eating pancakes in silence. He looked at me for a long moment, syrup still dripping from his fork, and said something I will never forget. Best not to get involved in other people's boundaries out here. I pressed him on what that meant, but he just shook his head and went back to his pancakes. The whole diner had gone quiet, and I became aware that several people were watching me with expressions that ranged from pity to something harder, something like warning. I finished my eggs without tasting them and left a bigger tip than usual, hoping that might loosen someone up. It did not. Outside, I ran into an older man loading bags of fertilizer into a pickup truck, and I tried one more time. I told him I was new to the area, just trying to understand the lay of the land, and asked if he knew anything about the property east of my place. He stopped loading and looked at me with pale blue eyes that had probably seen 70 winters or more. He said the land out there had history, that people who owned it tended to keep to themselves, and that I should do the same. When I asked what kind of history, he just climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had been going on for decades, speaking a language everyone understood but me. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed around 1 in the morning, not quite asleep but drifting in that halfway state, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate, crunching along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I got up and moved to the window without turning on any lights, keeping myself pressed against the wall so I could see out without being seen. A vehicle was rolling past my property on Hendricks Mill Lane. A large pickup truck or maybe an SUV, I could not tell for certain because it had no headlights on. Just a dark shape moving through the darker night, engine barely above idle. It passed my driveway and continued down the road toward the eastern property, then disappeared around a bend. I stood at that window for maybe 15 minutes waiting until I saw it come back the other way. Same speed, same silence, same absence of lights. This time it slowed even more as it passed my house, and I swear I could feel eyes scanning my windows, even though I could not see anyone inside the vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After it passed, I did not go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light off, watching the road through the window above the sink until the sun came up. The morning brought something worse. I walked the perimeter of my farmhouse the way I had started doing every day, checking for anything out of place, and that is when I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt beneath my bedroom window, 2 distinct boot prints, deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. The window itself was about 5 feet off the ground, too high to see in without effort, but if someone stood on their toes or brought something to stand on, they would have had a clear view of my bed. I crouched down and studied those prints, trying to memorize every detail. Work boots size 11 or 12 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. There were more prints leading away from the window, tracking through the grass toward the back of the property. I followed them for about 200 yards until they reached an old irrigation ditch that cut through the fields toward the eastern boundary. The ditch was dry and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years, but the vegetation had been trampled flat in a narrow path. Someone had been using this ditch as a corridor to access my property without being seen from the road. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. A deputy named Womack came out around 4, a tall man with a sunburned neck and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen everything twice. I showed him the footprints, which had dried and hardened in the midday heat, and walked him out to the irrigation ditch. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, nodding occasionally, writing nothing down. When I finished, he stood there looking out toward the eastern property for a long moment before speaking. He said that folks out here valued their privacy, that property lines could be complicated when you had old irrigation rights and shared access roads from decades past. I told him someone had been watching me through my bedroom window, and he said he understood my concern, but that there was not much he could do without more evidence. No crime had technically been committed. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything else happened, but the way he said it made me feel like he was just going through the motions. I watched his cruiser disappear down Hendricks Mill Lane and realized I was completely on my own out here. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom window and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. The next 3 days were quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from a surveyor or someone checking utility lines. Maybe the vehicle without headlights was just a local taking a shortcut who did not want to disturb anyone. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to focus on soil samples and irrigation schedules instead of what might be lurking in the darkness. But on the 4th night, a Wednesday, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Not imagined, not dreamed, real footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the old wooden boards. I lay perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, listening as they moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then they stopped right outside my front door. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, testing to see if it was locked. It was. The footsteps resumed, circling around the side of the house, pausing at each window. I tracked the sound as it moved, living room, kitchen, bathroom, until it reached the back door. Another doorknob test, another locked barrier. Then nothing. Silence so complete it roared in my ears. I did not move until sunlight started bleeding through the curtains, and when I finally got up to check, I found fresh boot prints circling the entire house. Same size, same wear pattern on the left heel. I decided I was done waiting for something worse to happen. That morning, I drove to the hardware store in Burkeville and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. I mounted it on a tree facing the irrigation ditch, angled to capture anyone coming onto my property from that direction. Then I bought a second one and placed it on the corner of my porch, aimed at the front door and the gravel driveway. The clerk who sold them to me, a young guy named Sutton with a patchy beard and nervous hands, asked if I was having trouble with wildlife. I told him something like that. He looked at me for a beat too long before ringing me up, and I got the sense he knew exactly what kind of trouble I was having. That night, I sat in my truck at the edge of the property with the engine off and the windows down, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars I had ordered online 2 days before. Around midnight, I saw them. 2 figures emerging from the barn on the neighboring property, moving across the field in my direction. They walked in single file, staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. I watched them enter the irrigation ditch about 300 yards out, and then I lost sight of them in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to start the truck and flood them with headlights, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until I heard the soft crunch of footsteps near my house. Then I laid on the horn for a solid 30 seconds. The sound shattered the night like a bomb. When I finally stopped, I heard running, fast, panicked, retreating toward the ditch. The trail cameras caught everything. 2 men, faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low, crossing onto my property around 12:15 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see they were carrying something, a duffel bag, maybe tools. I could not tell for certain. I saved the files to my phone and drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles north, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. The trooper who reviewed the footage, a woman named Kendrick with close-cropped gray hair and no patience for small talk, made some calls while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, she told me what the locals had refused to say. The property to the east had been flagged in a federal investigation. Something about illegal cultivation hidden in the back acreage, distribution networks running through rural properties with absentee owners. The agricultural trust was a front, and the people operating out of there had been watching me since the day I arrived, trying to figure out if I was law enforcement or just an unlucky contractor who had wandered into the wrong place. Trooper Kendrick arranged for me to break my lease that same day. No penalties, no questions. I packed everything I owned in under 2 hours and drove north without looking back. I found out later that a raid happened about 3 weeks after I left. Multiple arrests, the whole operation dismantled. Sometimes I still think about those nights alone in that farmhouse, the footsteps circling in the darkness, the eyes watching from the tree line. The countryside had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, so empty and quiet, but the silence was never emptiness. It was just everyone around me holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. At the time, my life felt small and quiet in a way I actually needed. I'd rented a lonely countryside house tucked between fields and looping back roads that only tractors and grain trucks seemed to know by heart. I worked remotely, kept odd hours, and barely saw another person once the sun went down. The house itself was old but solid, with thick doors, narrow windows, and a long gravel driveway that disappeared into darkness at night. Most evenings were spent with a lamp on, the wind moving the trees and the distant hum of insects. I liked how cut off it felt, like the world had decided to leave me alone for a while. That sense of isolation was the whole reason I chose the place. It never occurred to me that someone else might notice how alone I was. The first thing that caught my attention happened late at night, when I was rinsing a mug at the sink and the room briefly brightened. Headlights slid across the far wall, slow and deliberate, not like a car passing through. I stepped closer to the window and watched the beams creep along the edge of the property, then disappear just beyond the trees. It didn't bother me much at first. Farm vehicles move strangely, and the roads around there twisted in ways that didn't make sense unless you drove them daily. Still, It kept happening, always after midnight, always slow. Sometimes the lights would pause, idling somewhere I couldn't see, engine low and patient. When they finally moved on, the darkness felt heavier than before. A couple weeks later, new sounds joined the routine. Early mornings, just before the sky started to lighten, faint clicks and soft pressure came from the front door. It wasn't violent or rushed, more like someone checking a locked car in a parking lot. One morning it was the back door, another time a window frame near the laundry room. Whoever it was never stayed long, and nothing was damaged. I walked the house afterward, heart thumping, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. That somehow made it worse. Locks untouched meant the person testing them knew they could wait. The storm arrived without much warning, rolling in heavy and loud, flattening the fields with rain and bending the trees until they groaned. The power cut out first, then the cell signal dropped to nothing, leaving the house humming with rain and silence. Candles barely pushed back the dark, and the wind kept hitting the walls like it was trying to listen through them. That was when the headlights came back, brighter this time, stopping so close the glow leaked under the curtains. I stood there realizing something with a clarity that made my chest ache. Whoever was outside hadn't been trying to get in before. They'd been learning the house, learning me, and waiting for the moment when no one could hear me call for help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind and the soft idle of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. The rain masked smaller sounds, but not all of them. Gravel shifted, slow footsteps pressing into wet ground, careful enough not to splash. A shadow moved past one of the side windows, tall and narrow, pausing where the glass met the frame. There was no rush in the movement, no panic. It felt practiced, like someone following steps they'd rehearsed in their head many times. I backed away from the window, keeping to the darker part of the room, trying to control my breathing as the house creaked around me. The first real contact came at the back door. Not a knock, not a bang, just the gentle turn of the handle testing the resistance. Metal whispered against metal. It stopped, then tried again, slower, as if whoever was outside wanted to feel exactly how much pressure it took. I moved through the hallway on bare feet, each board threatening to betray me with noise. The flashlight in my hand shook enough that the beam bounced along the walls. When I reached the kitchen, the handle stopped moving, replaced by a long, thoughtful silence. I imagined someone standing there in the rain, hand resting on the door, deciding what came next. Minutes stretched until time lost its shape. The storm howled, thunder rolling so close it rattled the cabinets. Then the testing began again, this time at a window near the living room. Fingers brushed the glass, slow and deliberate, tracing the edge like they were memorizing it. I crouched behind the couch, phone useless in my hand, and realized how completely cut off I was. No lights from neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but fields and dark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about breaking in fast. It was about waiting me out, seeing how long fear could do the work instead. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The headlights stayed for a while longer, washing the side of the house in white, then finally pulled away. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry and left the house unlocked behind me, gravel crunching too loud under my tires as I drove away. Later, a local deputy walked the property and found nothing but deep footprints pressed into the mud near every door and window. No sign of forced entry. I never went back. Whatever patience had been waiting for me out there didn't need another chance. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whole thing, those headlights, the quiet testing, sat with me like a shadow, one I couldn't outrun. It's easy to tell yourself things like, maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or there's a perfectly logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I still couldn't explain how someone could have learned that house so thoroughly without ever stepping foot inside, or why they'd only been testing, never forcing. There was no conclusion to the nightmare that made sense. No one came forward. No evidence was found. The sheriff's department gave me the usual keep an eye out talk and moved on. But I couldn't. A few months later, I did some digging, trying to find answers. or at least make peace with the strange events. Turns out, a similar pattern had been reported in a nearby town years before. Another woman, renting another old farmhouse, had noticed headlights passing by her home, followed by strange behavior around her doors. She'd left too, but by the time she did, the sheriff had already dropped her case. She was never even given the chance to speak in person, her complaint buried in bureaucracy. Like mine, her story faded into nothingness. I still think about that night. The silence after the headlights disappeared was one of the loudest things I've ever heard. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. I've learned a few things in the time since. How fragile a sense of safety can be. How quickly it can be snatched away. But there's one thing that still haunts me more than anything. Whoever it was wasn't interested in me getting away. They were waiting for the moment when I couldn't leave. And that, more than anything, is what still keeps me up at night. Posting this here feels strange, but the memory still sits heavy with me, and maybe someone out there will recognize pieces of it. At the time, my life was simple and a little worn around the edges, the kind of phase where quiet feels like a solution to everything. I had just bought a neglected rural farm through a county auction, drawn in by the low price and the promise of isolation. The listing described it as vacant for years, a forgotten patch of land with a farmhouse and an old barn leaning into the wind. I imagined slow mornings, manual work, and the kind of silence you can't buy in town. Friends thought it was impulsive, but impulsive felt better than stagnant. The drive out there was long and empty, gravel roads stretching farther than expected. By the time I unlocked the farmhouse door, the sun was already low, turning the fields dull and flat. The first hours were spent opening windows and pushing stale air out of the rooms. Dust coated every surface, but not in the uniform way abandoned places usually collect it. Inside a bedroom closet, shirts still hung on mismatched hangers, sleeves stiff but not decayed. In the kitchen, canned food lined a shelf, labels faded but intact, some arranged with a care that didn't match abandonment. A notebook sat on the table, pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates from only a few months earlier. That detail caught my attention more than anything else, because the auction paperwork claimed no one had lived there in years. I walked room to room, noticing small things that felt paused rather than left behind. A chair angled toward a window, a pair of work boots by the door, a half-used bar of soap. None of it fit the story I had been sold. As evening settled in, the property took on a different tone. Sounds carried farther than expected, each creak of wood snapping sharp in the open air. While unloading tools from my truck, a dull thud echoed from the barn, deep and hollow. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scramble either. It sounded deliberate, like weight shifting. I stood still, listening, counting my breaths without meaning to. The barn doors were shut, chained the way I'd left them earlier. When I walked closer, the smell of hay and damp earth grew stronger, and the noise stopped completely. That silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Later that night, curiosity won out over caution. With a flashlight in hand, I crossed the yard again, beam cutting through tall grass and catching movement that turned out to be nothing at all. Near the barn, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, clear and sharp, leading away from the doors toward the farmhouse. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. The prints followed a path I had walked earlier, then veered off, circling back toward the house. Standing there, I felt exposed in a way that's hard to explain, like the land itself was watching. I locked every door when I went back inside, double-checking each one, even though I knew it wouldn't change much. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sense that the house wasn't as empty as it claimed to be. Morning light didn't bring the relief I expected. The house looked ordinary again, almost harmless, but the details from the night before refused to fade. Over coffee made with bottled water, I went through the notebook I'd found, reading the entries slowly. The writing jumped between mundane notes about chores and sharper comments about noises, doors left open, and shadows near the tree line. One page mentioned someone entering the barn repeatedly, always after dark, always leaving no trace by morning. That conflicted with the official records I'd reviewed before buying the place, so I drove into the nearest town to ask questions. The county office was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of old paper. When I mentioned the farm, the clerk paused longer than necessary before answering. According to public records, the previous owners had left abruptly, citing safety concerns that never made it into formal complaints. No police reports, no inspections, no follow-up visits. It was treated like a quiet relocation, the kind rural families make without explanation. An older man waiting behind me leaned in and said he remembered lights moving across that land late at night, long after it was supposed to be empty. He shrugged it off as trespassers or kids looking for trouble, but his voice lacked conviction. Driving back, I noticed tire tracks near the fence line that hadn't been there the day before. They stopped short of the road as if someone preferred not to be seen coming or going. By the time I reached the house, the sense of being observed had returned. That afternoon, I focused on clearing brush around the barn, trying to ground myself in physical work. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint smell of sweat and old fabric. In a corner stall, I found a blanket folded neatly, still holding the shape of recent use. There were food wrappers tucked behind a beam, the kind you'd eat in a hurry, trying not to make noise. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to match an abandoned property. As the sun dipped again, the same sounds returned, footsteps shifting above the hayloft. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly against wood and metal, and the movement stopped immediately. Night fell faster than I wanted it to. From the farmhouse window, I saw a light flicker in the barn, faint but unmistakable. This time I didn't approach blindly. I grabbed my truck keys and headlights swept the yard as I drove closer, flooding the space with harsh white beams. The barn stood open, doors wide, chain cut clean through. No one was inside, but the footprints were there again, leading straight back toward the house. I didn't stay to search further. I left the property before midnight, drove until my hands steadied on the wheel, and didn't return until days later with help. The farm was sold again soon after, quietly, and I never learned who had been living there, or why they stopped the moment I showed up. Returning to the property days later felt different, like crossing into a place that no longer wanted me there. I brought a friend with me, someone practical who didn't scare easily, and we walked the land in daylight. The farmhouse looked unchanged, but the barn told another story. Inside, the blanket was gone, the wrappers vanished, and the loft was swept clean as if someone had taken care to erase themselves. Even the footprints had been smoothed out, dirt dragged flat with something heavy. My friend tried to laugh it off, suggested squatters who got nervous once the place sold. The explanation sounded thin even as he said it. Nothing about the cleanup felt rushed or careless. We spent hours checking every structure, every shed, every line of fence. Near the far edge of the property, hidden behind tall weeds, we found a narrow footpath leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map, worn down just enough to suggest repeated use. Along the trail were small signs of life: a crushed soda can, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, boot marks half filled with dirt. Whoever used it knew how to move without leaving much behind. Standing there, I realized how easy it would be to watch the house from that spot, to wait until lights went out. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like exposure instead. That night I stayed in a motel in town instead of the farmhouse. Sleep came easier there, but my thoughts kept circling back to the notebook and those recent dates. The idea that someone had been living alongside the myth of abandonment unsettled me more than any noise. It wasn't a ghost story or some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Someone had been there, close enough to hear footsteps, close enough to know routines, and careful enough to vanish when attention arrived. The county never followed up, and no one seemed interested in reopening the past. Silence, I learned, can be a form of protection in small places. In the end, I made a practical choice. I listed the farm and sold it without ever spending another night there. I never mentioned the belongings or the footprints, just said the land wasn't the right fit. Sometimes I still think about whoever lived in those shadows and why they stopped when I appeared. Maybe they moved on to another forgotten place, or maybe they learned to stay hidden better. I don't know, and that's the part that lingers. The farm taught me that isolation doesn't always mean empty, and that some spaces remember people long after the records forget them. Moving into that house marked the start of a quieter chapter of my life, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I had just inherited a small place tucked far from any city, surrounded by fields that rolled on longer than my patience for traffic ever had. My days back then were simple: remote work in the mornings, unpacking boxes in the afternoons, and long walks at dusk to clear my head. The town itself looked like something preserved on purpose. One main road, a few aging storefronts and houses spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I told people online I was craving isolation, but the truth was I needed distance from everything that had piled up behind me. The house wasn't special: creaky floors, outdated cabinets, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Still, it felt like a reset button I desperately wanted to press. The locals made a point of introducing themselves within my first few days. Always polite, always brief. Names slipped out of my head quickly, but faces didn't, especially the way some of them lingered longer than necessary when we spoke. Conversations followed the same pattern: questions about how long I planned to stay, whether I worked from home, and what time I usually turned in at night. At first, I chalked it up to small-town curiosity, the kind people warn you about but never really explain. Every wave from across the road felt practiced, synchronized even. One woman, Rachel, who lived 2 houses down, casually mentioned she noticed my porch light stayed on late. She said it with a laugh, but it landed heavier than she probably intended. It didn't take long before people started commenting on my movements before I ever brought them up. Someone at the general store asked if my morning walks helped with sleep, even though I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Another neighbor suggested I avoid certain back roads once the sun dipped too low, offering no reason beyond a shrug and a vague warning tone. The strangest part wasn't the advice itself, but how consistent it was, as if everyone had rehearsed the same lines. Each evening, I caught glimpses of figures lingering near fences or parked trucks that hadn't been there moments before. Curtains across the street shifted whenever my front door opened. I started varying my routine without telling anyone, just to see if the comments would stop. They didn't. The first real crack in my sense of safety came quietly, almost easy to miss. A kitchen drawer I knew I had closed sat open when I returned from a short drive. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and the locks were exactly as I'd left them. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Small things out of place, a chair angled differently, a window unlatched but not forced. When I mentioned it at the local station, the officer listened with a thin patience that felt rehearsed. He suggested stress, settling in nerves, and reminded me that people here respected privacy. Walking back home, I noticed the same parked truck at the edge of my driveway that had been there earlier. Engine cold, tires dusty. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being monitored. Sleep became fragmented after that, not because of noise, but because of the silence pressing in on me. At night, the house made sounds I couldn't quite place, soft shifts that didn't belong to old wood settling. I started leaving objects exactly where I could remember them, down to the angle of a mug handle or the position of a rug corner. More than once, I woke to find those details altered by morning. The air inside the house sometimes carried a faint scent that wasn't mine, like unfamiliar soap or cold fabric pulled from storage. When I asked Rachel if she ever had issues with people wandering onto her property, she paused longer than usual before answering. She told me everyone looks out for each other here, and that I should be grateful for the attention. The sense of being managed rather than protected grew stronger as days passed. People would appear when I returned home, as if alerted the moment my tires hit the gravel. One man I'd never spoken to greeted me by name while leaning against my mailbox, commenting on how late I was compared to usual. I asked how he knew, and he smiled like I'd asked something naive. He said routines matter in places like this, that predictability keeps things peaceful. That word stuck with me, peaceful, because nothing about the way he said it felt calm. It sounded more like a rule than a reassurance. I tried pushing back in small ways, staying out longer, taking different routes, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using. The reactions came quickly. A note appeared on my porch one evening, written in careful block letters, warning me about roads I didn't need to test. Another time, someone knocked just after dark to tell me my back window had been open earlier, even though I'd been home all day. When I mentioned the notes and visits to the authorities again, the response was polite but firm. They said newcomers often misread community concern, and that stirring things up wouldn't help me settle in. The message was clear without being spoken outright. Isolation crept in next, heavy and deliberate. Phone calls dropped unexpectedly, internet outages became frequent, and my requests for repairs were delayed without explanation. I stopped receiving mail altogether for a stretch, even though I saw the delivery truck pass by. The house felt smaller with each passing night, like the walls were inching closer in agreement with the town. I realized then that leaving wasn't just discouraged, it was expected if I couldn't adapt. Outsiders didn't challenge the rhythm here. They either learned it or disappeared from it, and for the first time since arriving I understood that the house wasn't the thing I'd inherited. It was the test. The turning point came late in the afternoon, when I returned from a supply run and found the front door unlocked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the handle, replaying every movement of my hands before I'd left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the house carried that same unfamiliar scent again, stronger this time. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. It wasn't threatening, not directly. It simply listed times, my usual departure, my return when lights went out. At the bottom, one sentence was written smaller than the rest, reminding me that life runs smoother when everyone agrees on the order of things. I didn't bother calling the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag with only what I could carry: clothes, documents, my laptop, and a few personal items that still felt like mine. As dusk settled in, cars passed my house slower than usual, headlights lingering on the windows. Someone knocked once, firm but unhurried, then walked away when I didn't answer. I stayed still on the living room floor, breathing shallow, listening to footsteps circle the house without ever rushing. It wasn't fear that pinned me there. It was clarity. This place wasn't dangerous in the way people expect. It was organized, and I wasn't part of the system. When night fully set in, I slipped out through the back, walking across the fields instead of using the driveway. The land dipped and rose in uneven waves, my shoes soaking through with dew. Behind me, I could hear distant engines starting, doors closing, but no one shouted or chased. They didn't need to. By the time I reached the main road, my legs burned and my phone had no signal, but the silence finally felt empty instead of watched. I flagged down a passing truck hours later and didn't explain much, only that I needed a ride far away. The driver didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. I never went back for the rest of my things. Weeks later, I received a single forwarded envelope at a temporary address, containing the house keys and a short note thanking me for understanding how things work there. No return address, no signature. I sold the property without setting foot on it again, accepted a price far lower than it was worth, and considered it a fair trade. Sometimes I still catch myself tracking routines out of habit, checking windows twice, listening too closely. I don't talk about that town out loud, but I know this much for sure. Some places don't want you harmed, they just want you compliant.